I'd like to begin by sharing some information about Diane Grant. Diane Ruth Grant was born in 1963 and raised in Archdale, a small town in Hampton County, South Carolina. Diane's mother, Sarah Bowen, was still a teenager when Diane was born, so she was brought up by her father's family. The community they lived in was very close-knit, with a population of just over 1,800 people, where everyone knew each other. Unfortunately, there isn't much available about Diane's childhood or teenage years, but I've gathered what I could. From what I know, Diane was deeply cherished by her extended family. She was known to be quiet and reserved, yet also warm-hearted and generous, with strong family values. She often spent time in the neighboring towns of Gifford and Scotia, which were even smaller than Archdale, with populations in the few hundreds. These towns were only about a 10-minute drive from her home. When Diane was in her late teens, she started dating a man from Gifford named Willie Lee DeVore, who was around her same age. The couple welcomed their first son, Marquess, in 1982, when Diane was 19 years old, and it appears the couple went on to get married. The day after Christmas, December 26th, in 1987, 24-year-old Diane gave birth to a second son that they named Jatavius. Then on July 16th, 1992, Diane and Willie's daughter was born, a little girl they named Deanna. Diane, of course, loved all of her children equally, but when Deanna came along, she was thrilled to finally have a daughter, a mini-me that she could dress up and one day look forward to all sorts of mother-daughter bonding activities that would cultivate a deep and loving relationship between girls and their mothers. Marquise was a very protective older brother, and Jatavius was his best friend. The boys felt even more protective of their sister Deanna because she was the baby of the family and also because she was a girl. The parenting dynamic in the DeVore household was one that many of us can probably relate to. Willie was your classic, easygoing, fun dad, while Diane was the one who kept the kids in line, but always in a positive and loving manner. By this time, Diane had been in touch with other people from her past, one whom she had never known even existed. As I mentioned, Diane had been raised by her father's family, but in her early 20s, she decided she wanted to reconnect with her mother, Sarah, who lived out in New York. After they started communicating once again, Diane got a huge surprise when her mother told her she had a brother that was 1 year older than she was, and he lived out in Connecticut. Diane could not believe this. The news was a shock in a lot of ways, but it was also an unexpected opportunity for her to get to know someone with whom she shared DNA and hopefully forge a close bond. This is happening more and more with sites like 23andMe and Ancestry, and I always wonder if I have any unknown siblings out there somewhere. But Diane got in touch with her brother, and they began gradually getting to know each other through emails and phone calls. They knew that one day, when they both felt comfortable, they would eventually meet. Sadly, around 1995, 32-year-old Diane and Willie's marriage came to an end. Marquise was 13, Jatavius was 7, and Deanna was just about 3 years old. Unlike so many couples, where things become difficult and hostile and the parenting arrangements break down, Willie and Diane were different. They managed to co-parent really successfully. Their kids were still so young, so they knew the most important thing was staying amicable and keeping disruption in the kids' lives as minimal as possible, ensuring they felt happy, safe, and loved at all times. They thought just because things didn't work out between them as a couple, this in no way meant they weren't 100% committed to being the best parents they could be. Marquise, Jatavius, and Deanna split their time between two different households, but this in no way diminished how loved they felt by their parents. The five of them were still a strong family unit, even if Willie and Diane were no longer in a romantic relationship. Now, also dealing with the challenge of a changed financial situation, in addition to being a single mom, Diane often worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and provide the best life she could for her kids. Whether she was working at a florist, a plastic manufacturer company, or even a record company at one stage in life, she commuted to work as a housekeeper in the resort destination of Hilton Head Island, something she couldn't have done had she not had the support of her extended family to help look after the kids. And of course, Diane was exceptionally grateful to have that network around her. Her co-workers at the plastics factory knew her as a go-getter, someone who was always busy and in 10 places at once. But she was also the kind of person who knew how to see the positive side of situations and overcome her hardships, no matter how tough they might be. Her childhood friend, Charles Hosendo, who attended school with Diane and went on to work with her at the plastics company, said that Diane was never really bothered by much, and if she wasn't the sort of person to make it known. In late 2001, 38-year-old Diane was presented with a new job opportunity, and she accepted a role at another manufacturing plant. Her co-workers threw her a farewell party. They were going to truly miss her professionalism, kindness, and of course her friendly face. Not everyone gets a farewell party when they leave a job, but Diane's new role wasn't in Ford. It was actually 90 miles away in the city of North Charleston in Dorchester County. This is the southernmost part of South Carolina, in the heart of what's known as the Low Country, and part of the broader Charleston metropolitan area. The first time that I was ever really introduced to the Low Country was when I was watching the Alec Murdaugh trial. So you may be familiar with this part of South Carolina if you followed that case. This is a historic, sprawling area, but it's one of the poorest regions in the state, unfortunately. As the third largest city in South Carolina, North Charleston straddles multiple counties, Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, where Diane and her youngest kids were going to move. The city, which is northwest of Charleston itself, is situated between two rivers, with the Ashley River to the west and the Cooper River to the east. North Charleston has a rich but complex history and cultural diversity among its residents. It was originally built off the exploitation of enslaved African people who arrived in the area via the slave trade. Over time, it continued to grow on the back of the agricultural industry. After its naval base was established at the turn of the 20th century, it also became home to a growing manufacturing and industrial sector. But of course, a lot had changed over the years, and in 2001, 38-year-old Diane, 14-year-old Jatavius, and 9-year-old Deanna made the move to see what awaited them. It was no doubt going to be tough for Diane, being a single mom and moving so far away from her support network, but she was up for the challenge, and she could see the opportunity was ultimately for the benefit of her children, with access to better education and better jobs. Even though they weren't moving out of state, it was no doubt a little bit scary and an uncertain time for the kids. North Charleston was home to over 81,000 people, way more than they were used to growing up in a very small town. The kids were also leaving behind everything they'd ever known, including their dad and their older brother Marquise, who was now 19. He decided to make an even bigger move, heading down to Florida on his own. Not long after arriving in Jacksonville, Marquise met a 19-year-old woman named Sonia, who would go on to become his wife. Sonia was hanging out, having a meal with her dad when Marcus spotted her, and he was immediately struck by how beautiful Sonia was. Marquise introduced himself, and of course, Sonia probably thought he was just as good-looking. With his bright greenish-blue eyes and olive skin, he definitely stood out in a crowd. They made a gorgeous couple, and soon they began seriously dating. It wasn't long before he and Sonia fell in love, and after about a year together, they took the plunge and moved in with one another. Meanwhile, Diane and the younger children had moved into the Archdale Forest apartment complex at 99 Shagbark Trail in North Charleston. The complex, which had on-site property management, consisted of 328 apartments and townhomes, divided up into multiple larger buildings, with around 5 dwellings in each building. Shagbark Trail looped around the complex, so the quiet wooded area had a cozy community feel where everyone looked out for one another. Kids hung out in the playground, by the pool, or in the picnic area, and people would wave to one another and walk their dogs. Residents felt really safe there, and there were minimal, if any, problems in terms of criminal activity. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna quickly settled into their apartment, 2113B. Diane worked hard at her new job to provide for her children and give them the best life she could. She was driven and intelligent, and despite working long hours, she put her kids first. She took immense pride in herself, especially in her appearance. Even though she worked these long hours, she knew how to keep herself together. She always made it look effortless as well. She was very classy and beautiful. Around 2004, she took a new job in quality control at the Robert Bosch manufacturing plant, working the second shift, which was great because it was only a 4-minute drive away from their home. The 40-year-old was soon a valuable and highly respected part of the team, and she stood out to her shift supervisor, Anthony Gillard, who described Diane as a stellar performer. Diane was always friendly and helpful as a neighbor, and she instilled these same qualities in her children. They were always there to lend a hand to others, and this is exactly how Jatavius met a lot of people in his community, especially some of his closest friends. He was known as a bit of a class clown, but like his mom, he was kind and generous. One day when Jatavius was driving home, he spotted his neighbor, 18-year-old Usha Mackey, walking around carrying a big laundry basket as she headed home. Jatavius pulled over and offered her a ride, and from then on, they were really close friends. Living so close to each other, they began hanging out regularly. Usha and Jatavius would either hang out at Diane's place or at another apartment nearby, and because the group didn't have to go far to walk home, it became quite usual for them to stay up well into the early hours of the morning, just talking, hanging out, and spending time together. Deanna, meanwhile, was growing into a young woman and developing a solid sense of self, which we know can be difficult during those awkward teenage years. Unlike her mom, Deanna wasn't quiet. She was quite a chatterbox. Her grandmother, Sarah, described her as very outspoken, which made Deanna popular at school. She made friends easily, especially in the apartment complex, thanks to her outgoing personality and very sweet, respectful manner. One neighbor, Tia Thomas, thought of Deanna as her own daughter, given her close relationship with two of the Thomas girls, who would go roller skating together and play around the community. As community-minded as Diane and her children were, they were definitely not the kind of neighbors to cause drama or to bother anyone. They didn't open the door to anyone they didn't know, but they were always there to help anyone who needed it. Now let's shift to what's happening down in Florida. Marquise and Sonia just welcomed their first child in 2002, a daughter, and then in 2005, Sonia gave birth to their son. Diane was, of course, ecstatic. She was now a grandma and couldn't do enough for her oldest son's growing family. But it was also hard on Diane being states away from her grandchildren. Like many young parents, Marquise, who was employed by a trucking company, and Sonia both had to work to pay the bills. When their children were old enough to go on a road trip to Diane's, she jumped at the opportunity. So, in May of 2007, Diane drove down to Jacksonville, Florida, to pick up her grandkids and drive them back to South Carolina, where they would spend the entire summer with her, their Aunt Deanna, and Uncle Jatavius. This would give Marquise and his wife a much-needed break to enjoy themselves as a couple. Sonia held her mother-in-law in high regard. She saw Diane as a very strong woman, a remarkable, elegant, strong mother who was very educated, and her beauty radiated from within. Diane really made a lasting impression on Sonia, who actually aspired to be like her and emulate those same qualities one day. Sonia, of course, trusted Diane with her children, and Diane promised to call Sonia and Marquise every day so they could speak with their kids while they were away that summer. Life was good and busy for 44-year-old Diane, her kids, and now her grandkids. Even though it had been years since her move, she still called in to visit her former co-workers back in her hometown. In early July, she and Deanna actually took a trip back to Gafford to visit Willie. But the hard-working single mom was about to mark an exciting and momentous milestone. Remember how I said that Diane had been in touch with her brother, whom she'd never met? Well, by now, they had agreed it was time to finally meet. Diane was super excited and looked forward to seeing her brother in the flesh for the very first time in the coming week. She figured that once her grandchildren had returned home to Florida after the summer, she would go up and see her mom, Sarah, in New York. Deanna had visited her maternal grandmother the previous Thanksgiving, but Diane hadn't seen her mom in a while. By this time, 20-year-old Jatavius had moved out of the apartment, and was enrolled in the Job Corps in Bamberg County. But in early July, he came to stay with his mom, his sister, his niece, and his nephew for a visit. Diane was thrilled to have so many of her loved ones under the same roof at the same time. 14-year-old Deanna was eagerly counting down the days to her 15th birthday. She loved taking her nephew for walks around the complex, pushing him along in his stroller, and waving to people she knew along the way. She had recently finished up at Oakbrook Middle School, where, on the last day, her principal, Principal Garland Crump, gave Deanna a hug and wished her luck in high school. Principal Crump would never forget Deanna. She flashed him a big grin and responded, "Mr. Crump, I will make you proud." Deanna was, of course, looking forward to starting 9th grade at Fort Dorchester High School. Most importantly, like many teenage girls, she wanted to have her high school wardrobe on point well in advance to make a good impression. A KRS shoe store had recently opened in the nearby mall at the Festival Center, and that's where you would often find her. She would spend her time browsing the many styles and colors for sale. She was there so much that she got to know the store's co-owner, Robin T., who could tell that for Deanna, it was like being a kid in a candy store. Robin trusted Deanna so much that if she was busy with a customer and Deanna was there, Robin would occasionally have Deanna go fetch shoeboxes from the back room and bring them out to customers to try on. One particular style that had caught Deanna's eye was a pair of bright yellow closed-toe pumps with nearly a 3-inch heel. It was easy to see why Deanna was drawn to these striking shoes, but Robin told her young customer she wouldn't sell them to her without her mom, Diane's approval. So on July 9th, before school started, Mom and daughter went to the shoe store to go shopping. Deanna was super excited when her mom agreed to let her purchase those yellow pumps that she had been obsessing over. It was going to be the perfect start to the school year, but sadly, no one knew what was about to happen next. In the early hours of the following morning, on July 10th, Archdale Forest resident Scott Morgan awoke to what sounded like a crack of a gunshot. Then he heard a scream and 3 more shots echoing around the apartment complex from wall to wall. Scott tried looking out his windows to see what was going on, but they were all fogged up due to the condensation from the air conditioning that he had running through the hot July night. Scott wasn't sure what he had just heard. At the same time, another resident, Matthew Rogers, was watching TV in bed with his fiancée when he heard the same thing. Except, the gunshots after the scream sounded like they were coming from directly behind Matthew's apartment building. Matthew called 911 at 2:24 a.m. He told the operator he and his fiancée were afraid to look out the window. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves if someone had a gun and was on the loose. Another caller reached out to the police, saying that there were gunshots outside of her apartment. Getting a call like this from a neighborhood like this one was actually very unusual. It was known as a safe, quiet community. Worcester County Sheriff's Deputy Patrolman Adam Smith and Joel Crisp were alerted and soon responded to the location in separate patrol cars. As Deputy Smith made his way onto Shagbark Trail, he kept an eye out for any suspicious vehicles or people that could be fleeing the scene. As he drove around the loop to his left, he saw an apartment door that was open in Building 213, and he could see a light on inside. So he radioed to Deputy Crisp to join him so they could approach the front door of the apartment together. It was apartment 2113B. Deputy Smith slowly approached the door from the right, with Deputy Crisp on the left. As the officers moved closer, Deputy Crisp could see inside the apartment right away. He saw what appeared to be 2 people lying motionless on the ground inside, about halfway between the kitchen and the back door, and both of them appeared to have suffered trauma to the head, possibly from a gunshot wound. Given that the resident Matthew Rogers had called 911 reporting gunshots, the deputies had no idea if someone was wielding a gun and was still inside the apartment. So they held their position and notified other responding units, including emergency medical services, who were quickly on their way. Sergeant Hill and Deputy Buckman soon arrived together. The 4 officers went inside the apartment unit. The layout was long and narrow. As they walked into the front door, there was a staircase to their left, and to the right was the kitchen with a narrow pathway leading into the dining and living room area. The first body that the officers saw as they made their way inside was that of a woman. Then, as they moved further into the home, they saw another person lying next to the couch in the living room area. It was the body of a young man lying half on his stomach and half on his right side. There were no signs of life from either of the two victims. The officers began to secure and clear the residence. They were satisfied that there was nobody else downstairs, so they made their way up the stairs to where the bedrooms were. That's when they noticed there were two young children in one of the rooms, and they appeared to be asleep. But of course, they weren't sure if they were also victims. So the officers moved closer and realized that both of them had been spared. They were just asleep and alive. One was a 5-year-old little girl, and the other was an 18-month-old little boy in his crib, but they were completely unharmed. Deputy Smith and Buckman carried the children downstairs and placed them in a patrol car. Shortly thereafter, the children were taken into custody by the Department of Social Services until other family members could be contacted. I cannot imagine how traumatizing this would have been for these little children to be woken up by police officers not knowing what was going on. Meanwhile, George Tesser County Coroner Chris N. Bett arrived at the scene and unfortunately pronounced both the man and the woman found in the living room dead at the scene. Officers had an idea of who may live in this apartment building based on the mail they found inside, but they weren't 100% sure of the deceased female's identity at this point, nor how the two victims had died. But it appeared they had both been shot in the head, based on what they gathered from the mail and speaking with the property manager on site. The residents who lived there were 44-year-old Diane Grant and 14-year-old DeVore, and that Diane's young grandchildren were visiting for the summer. At first, the investigators believed that the female lying on the ground in the living room was Deanna, and that Diane wasn't home. Detective Earl Asel of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office Crime Scene Unit arrived on the scene after being advised that at least one murder had occurred, with the killer possibly taking their own life. This was the assumption, given the finding of the male and female inside, without an understanding of who these people were. Because that was the working theory at the point, Detective Asel began taking photographs and processing the apartment for evidence. On the floor near the encounter, he found and collected 2.40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casings. A significant amount of blood spatter was on the back of the front door, and this initially suggested that the victims may have been beaten. But the female victim had a hole in her left cheek that appeared to be an exit wound, which accounted for that spatter. The bullet had then entered the wall on the right-hand side of the dining room table, 2 feet and 9 inches from the floor, exiting into an apartment next door. So, Detective Asel went to that apartment to ensure no one else was hurt after the bullet traveled through the wall. Thankfully, it lodged itself into a drawer and didn't harm anyone else. Crime scene technicians did a gunshot residue test on both bodies. The fact that there didn't appear to be any firearms in the apartment now made it clear that this was not a case where someone shot the woman and then took their own life. No, this was a double murder. The victims were then transported to the coroner's office, and the officers were still unsure of their identities. But whoever had shot the victims had either brought the weapon with them or potentially stolen it from the home. But there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. Someone, perhaps the killer but not the officers, had left 2 impressions of dirt on the floor between the kitchen and the dining room. So, Detective Asel obtained 2 gel lifts of these impressions to see if they could determine the type and size of shoes of the potential killer. A gel lift is a thin film with tacky rubber gel with backing on the other side. It's placed onto a shoe impression and then peeled up to lift the impression from the floor. Basically, it's a lot like fingerprinting, but for shoes to determine things like make, style, and size, and sometimes any unique tread marks from the circular pattern on the ball of the foot and heel. In this case, the detective took an educated guess that the shoes were Nike brand Air Force One sneakers or something with a very similar tread design. There were a pair of men's size 10 Nike Air Force One sneakers right next to the couch in the living room, and they seemed to have the same pattern as the shoe impressions on the floor. Both this pair and another pair were taken in for analysis, along with the gel lifts. The detectives then took blood swabs and fingerprinted the counter, where he could see that somebody had touched it. He also took swabs from the door handles and the dining room table, which had high-velocity blood spatter and some strands of hair on it, which was most likely a result of the shot to Diane's head. Detective John Garrison of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Department arrived, and he was the lead investigator, assisted by Major Mike Turner and Sergeant Michael Miller. Detective Garrison was surprised to learn that there had been reports of a shooting at Archdale Forest. This wasn't a neighborhood known for violence, let alone shootings. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office and the North Charleston Police Department were also there to assist. Detective Garrison began organizing officers going door to door to find and interview neighbors who had called 911, including Matthew Rogers. They also dispersed to conduct a general canvass of the entire neighborhood to inquire if anyone had seen or heard anything. While only a couple of 911 calls came in, numerous residents had heard the commotion outside. But the fact that it all occurred in the dead of night meant that none of these residents had actually witnessed anything, nor had they heard any vehicles speeding off. Like other residents, Janice AMT told the officers that she thought someone was actually setting off fireworks close to the back porch of her apartment. She said that if she had thought for a second it was gunshots, she would have left her apartment, gone across the street, and got one of her neighbors, who was actually a sheriff's deputy. The complex's on-site property manager spoke to the investigators again, and after a description of the victims was given to her, she explained that the residents of 213B were initially Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. However, based on the information provided to her by the detective, she believed that it was most likely the mother, Diane, and the son, Jatavius, who were the victims. But then, where was Deanna? She wasn't in her bed, so was she staying with a friend? Or, even worse, what if she had been abducted or somehow involved and was now on the run? These cases can really go in any direction, so officers fanned out across the apartment complex to see if there was any sign of the missing teenager. Tragically, it wasn't until the sun began to rise that investigators would get their answer. Around 6:30 a.m., two detectives found the body of a young female lying on the muddy ground behind Building 105, next to an electrical box. She was wearing a tank top, but was naked from the waist down and barefoot. A pair of pajama bottoms with a pair of underwear were inside and placed on top of the electrical box. She was preliminarily identified as 14-year-old Deanna DeVore. The seasoned detectives had seen a lot in their careers, but still, nothing prepares you for seeing something like this. It was just horrendous. They noticed that she had managed to run quite a bit away, since Building 105 was separated from Building 213 by a road, a small ravine, and 3 other apartment buildings. They wondered why she was so far from her home, but they theorized that she was, of course, running away from a killer. She could have also been trying to get the young children out of harm's way by luring the killer far away from the apartment where the children were sleeping in their beds. She was lying on her side, and it appeared as though she had been shot several times at close range. It also looked like she might have been the victim of a forced sex act due to her clothing being removed. In the grass near her body, there were 4 Federal brand .40 caliber shell casings, and underneath her body were 2 bullets of the same caliber. There were also shoe prints in the ground that had been disturbed, as if there had been a struggle of some kind in that area. As with Diane and Jatavius, the detectives conducted gunshot residue testing on Deanna, and they decided to take cement castings of the shoe prints that were in the mud. Back at the apartment, with the advantage of daylight, the detectives noticed even more shoe prints in the mud near the front door, and those were also collected. It seemed they had the same sole pattern as the ones that were inside the apartment, plus there was a footprint left there as well. At the sheriff's office, the 6 shell casings were processed for latent fingerprints, but none were found. Once there was an official identification made of the three victims, the officers had to break the devastating news to Diane's surviving son, Marquise, and his wife, Sonia, down in Florida. Their children were visiting Diane. She'd been caring for them for the past 6 weeks or so. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna had all been killed. It's the most unbelievable, unexpected, and heartbreaking news a person can get. That's basically their entire family that had been murdered. Before Marquise even got the call, he was driving to work that morning, just driving along, when suddenly he said he was overcome with a wave of emotion and just burst into tears. The 25-year-old was confused about why he was feeling that way. It was not like this man to just start crying out of the blue, but he knew that something had to be wrong. He had no idea what it was. When Marquise arrived back at the office, a detective from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department was there to talk to him. She broke the news to Marcus, who was stunned. 3 of the most important people in his life were dead in a homicide. As Marquis struggled to come to terms with his shock and disbelief, his thoughts quickly turned to his own children. He knew that he would be a complete wreck after hearing that news, knowing that his children were in that house. An immense wave of relief washed over him when he was told that his kids were safe and temporarily in the care of social services. There were so many thoughts and emotions for Marquise to process, and his wife Sonia felt exactly the same way. When he had to break the news to her, she just kept repeating, "Who would do this? Why? Why?" Then her concern quickly turned to their 2 children. Without hesitating, the heartbroken couple jumped in their car and made the drive to South Carolina. They were still trying to make sense of who could have possibly done something like this to their family. None of them had any enemies. They worked hard, studied hard, and lived good, honest lives. Marquise and Sonia weren't the only ones trying to work out what had happened. Diane's ex-husband, Willie, was just as shocked and heartbroken when he learned that his ex-wife and 2 of their children had been gunned down in cold blood. At the same time, Detective Garrison needed to make inquiries as to whether Diane's ex-husband Willie knew anything about the incident. As we know, it's those closest to the victims who are often involved. Even though Diane and the younger kids had moved away from DeVore, there had still been a marriage that broke down. Even if an ex-spouse isn't involved, they need to be eliminated as suspects. So, Willie told investigators he was just as confused as Marquise about who could possibly have done this, who would target his family in such a brutal way. He flatly denied having any involvement in this crime. Willie claimed he had been in bed at the time of the murders because he had to be at work at 5 a.m., and this was corroborated by others who knew him. Willie knew that if he left the house during that time frame, his own security cameras would show that, and police were ultimately satisfied that he was home the entire night. The State Law Enforcement Division, which is known as SLED, oversaw the autopsies and the collection of evidence from the victims' bodies. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cynthia Shandell conducted 2 of the autopsies, while Dr. Susan Presell performed the other. Both Diane and Jatavius had each been killed by a single close-range gunshot to the head. Diane was shot in the back right-hand side of her head, with the bullet exiting her left cheek. Jatavius had a laceration due to blunt force injury on the right side of his scalp and a skull fracture underneath. He also had several scrapes on his body. He suffered a close-range gunshot wound through his left cheek just below his eye, which traveled into his head through his brainstem. The bullet was recovered in 3 fragments from the back right side of Jatavius's head. Diane had been shot at least 4 times at close range in the face, below her right eye, and in the right side of her neck, and part of the bullet had shot her in the face and exited the side of her neck next to her jaw. The fatal shot was likely the one to the neck, which immediately shattered her brainstem and spinal cord. Another gunshot fractured Diane's upper spine, which, had she survived, would have meant she would have lived with significant physical impairment and most likely would have not been able to walk again. Deanna had also been shot in the upper right part of her back. The bullet exited above her left collarbone and caused bleeding into her left lung. She sustained another gunshot wound to her right shoulder. She clearly sustained more damage than her mother and her brother. Swabs were taken from Deanna's mouth and the lower private areas of her body, and these revealed the presence of semen on her mouth area and on her pajama pants. They were sent in for testing. However, there was no indication at this time that there had been any penetration of her genital area. As arrangements were being made for Dina, Jatavius, and Deanna to be laid to rest back in their hometown of Gford, on the evening of July 16th, a vigil was held for them at the Tree of Life Ministries in North Charleston. Among the 175 people that paid their respects and came together to honor the victims were Jatavius's friend Usha Mackey and Diane's former supervisor, Anthony Gillard. On July 18th, just 2 days after what would have been Deanna's 15th birthday, Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones had to say their goodbyes to them at their joint funeral. There were so many people anticipated for that service that it was actually held at the elementary school auditorium. To me, it is always heartbreaking to see more than one casket lined up next to one another, just a family gone altogether. This was the moment everything became real for Marquise. He would never see his mother again, and never see his younger brother and sister, whom he'd always fiercely tried to protect. Now they were gone. While Marcus was, of course, beyond thankful that his own children were physically unharmed, there was no denying that things would change forever. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna were all buried at the Mount Zion Cemetery back in Gford, but Marcus was still scared. If someone could shoot 3 members of his family at close range, and apparently force themselves upon his teenage sister, a family who hadn't done anything bad to anyone, then what was stopping them from jumping in their car and heading to Florida to do the same thing to Marquise and his family? No one knew why they were targeted to begin with, but at this stage, law enforcement felt that the victims knew their assailant, but were staying tight-lipped about the investigation. Tia Thomas, whose daughters were good friends with Deanna, told one newspaper that, from what she observed, Jatavius was a pleasant young man, but he had supposedly been running around with a rougher crowd lately. Investigators wondered if the killer could have known the family this way, but still, there didn't seem to be a motive. Nothing seemed to be stolen from the apartment, and it seemed Deanna was chased down and then, of course, forced into a sex act, so they needed to dig deeper. As authorities looked back to see if there had been any previous police involvement, they noted that, a month before the murders, a neighbor had reported that Diane's grandchildren had actually been left alone in the apartment. Jatavius was supposed to be the one babysitting the kids, which would make sense because Diane was at work. However, somehow the younger children had accidentally been locked inside a bedroom in the apartment. Both of the kids were totally unharmed, and a maintenance man had to come and unlock the door. Apparently, the Department of Social Services had to be notified, but there was never anything to follow up on. Still, this incident didn't seem to be related to the murders in any way, and it didn't indicate who the killer would be. The following evening, at a community meeting providing an update on this investigation, Dexter County Sheriff Ray Nash told a gathering of about 40 concerned residents that, at this stage, law enforcement had no reason to believe that this was just a random crime, but they still didn't know what the motive was for the murders. Of course, this did nothing to calm this community. They knew a killer was still on the loose. Among those in attendance were residents of Building 105, where Diane's body had been found 4 hours after the shooting. They were unhappy that it had taken so long for her body to be found, largely due to the way she had been laid out in the open, exposed all of that time. Nor could they understand why it had taken so long for deputies to find Diane. Given that the 911 calls came from residents in Building 105 itself, because one caller said she heard gunshots right in the back of her apartment in Building 105. Sheriff Nash explained that, until additional units arrived on the scene, the sheriff's office only had 3 or 4 deputies to patrol this entire bigger area of the apartment complex. At this point, evidence was still being collected and processed. The shoes that had left the impressions on the floor were identified by SLED agent Vicky Hinton as Nike Air Force One sneakers. Detective Aisel had been right. Meanwhile, The .640 caliber shell casings had undergone thorough ballistics analysis and testing by SLED. There's something that I want to explain quickly here and give you some background. In very basic terms, when a firearm is discharged, the firing pin inside leaves a unique mark on the back of the bullet shell casing. This means you can not only trace a shell casing to a particular make of a gun, but also to a specific weapon. Again, this is sort of like fingerprinting but for guns, and no two guns will leave the same mark on the shell casing. They always have their own very minuscule internal imperfections, so it would be impossible for the killer or killers to blame it on any other weapon. For all intents and purposes, all 3 shots look to have come from an identical gun. As the testing was being conducted on the markings on the shell casings of this triple murder, SLED agent Tracy Thrower found that not only had these all been fired from the same weapon, but the markings also matched shell casings from 2 other shootings. They were able to figure this out thanks to what's known as the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, which is sort of like CODIS. You know how we look for DNA that's related to other crimes? This system matches shell casings with the same type of markings. The system acts like a screening tool that compares the images to other similar images to find similarities between unconnected cases, or I should say, previously unconnected cases. This means that those might end up being related to this triple murder. In Agent Thrower's opinion, the likelihood that another firearm could have produced the type of markings on these shell casings in the 3 shootings was so rare, it would be practically impossible. This was the first big break in this case. One of the other shootings where the same weapon seemed to have been used was committed at the Anchor Bar and Grill in North on March 4th, just over 4 months before the DeVore murders. In this previous case, .640 caliber Smith & Wesson casings were found in a parking lot. The other crime with related casings occurred as a drive-by on March 20th at another apartment complex called Hunter Ridge Apartments on Hunter Ridge Lane in Chester County. This is off Ashley Phosphate Road, and around 24 shell casings were found on the road following the shooting. Nobody was killed or injured in either of these other shootings, but they did remain unsolved. Still, investigators knew if they could find the person or persons involved in either of those previous shootings, where at least there could be witnesses, this could potentially lead them to whoever killed Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. Not only had no arrest been made in the Anchor Bar shooting, but there were no suspects, so SLED contacted North Charleston PD for their reports on those incidents. On July 19th, detectives spoke to a bouncer who had been working at the Anchor Bar that night, and his name was Regal Chavers. According to Regal, in the early morning hours of March 4th, a man had been kicked out of the bar, which was only 12 miles from the Archdale Forest Complex, where the DeVore family was eventually killed. Regal said he saw the patron walk across the parking lot and get into a black pickup truck. The vehicle's front and back passenger windows were rolled down. As the pickup pulled away, the man inside picked up a semi-automatic handgun and fired a single shot from the back seat. Someone else sitting in the driver's seat then fired multiple shots using what seemed like a Tech-9 submachine gun. Regal described the man in the back seat as being a shorter black male, around 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall, about 25 years old, with closely cropped hair. Police had already arrested someone for the shooting at the Hunter Ridge apartment, which was even closer to where Diane's apartment was, less than 4 miles away. His name was Xavier Walker, and he was currently out on bond. Several eyewitnesses who knew Xavier had identified him as one of the 2 shooters at the Hunter Ridge scene, and he was charged. But when investigators went to speak to Xavier about Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's murders, he denied knowing anything about the slayings. He also denied being the shooter at Hunter Ridge or the Anchor Bar. However, he said that he did have the name of the person who was with him on both of those occasions, but Xavier would only give law enforcement the information if he could have his own charges dropped. Once they struck a deal with him, he said that on the night of March 4th, he'd been at the bar with his friend, 25-year-old Anthony Sanders. when Anthony was kicked out of the bar around 4:30 in the morning. The men got into the pickup truck that Anthony had borrowed from a friend. Anthony was in the driver's seat with Xavier beside him. As they drove through the parking lot, Anthony shot at the bar outside the window using a semi-automatic handgun. But didn't the eyewitness say that one guy was in the back seat shooting and one was up front? It seems the story is a little bit off, but they let him continue because it's all they had. Xavier then claimed that on March 20th, he'd been in a fight with someone who lived at the Hunter Ridge apartment complex. He said later that day, the same guy that he was with the night at the bar, Anthony Sanders, had picked him up in a vehicle, and they drove back to Hunter Ridge together. There was a shootout, and Xavier claimed Anthony had fired several shots at someone who shot at them first. Of course, that would be the story. Xavier stated that Anthony had used the same weapon on both occasions. It was encouraging that detectives now had another person of interest, but they had no way of knowing whether Anthony was really involved and, if so, to what extent. Was Xavier the killer, and was he just trying to make his friend the scapegoat? They didn't know. But as investigators looked further into Anthony, they learned he was unemployed and no stranger to breaking the law. He already had a criminal record for a variety of offenses. In August 2002, Anthony was charged with possession with the intent to distribute drugs and possession with the intent to distribute drugs in the proximity of a school. In January the following year, he was charged with 3 counts of simple assault, but was only convicted of one of those. Later that year, he was charged with a DUI and driving while his license was suspended. In May of 2004, he was charged with driving with a suspended license and possession of drugs. Anthony was born on July 1, 1982, and he grew up in the Charleston area. He never knew his father, but he had a sister and several brothers, including an identical twin named Tony. Based on Anthony's criminal record, Dorchester County decided that in order to get more information about whether or not he was involved in the DeVore family murders, they were going to initiate a surveillance operation to see whether Anthony would incriminate himself or possibly lead police to the murder weapon. While monitoring him, Anthony was arrested during a traffic stop on July 24th, and they were able to take him in for illegally discharging a firearm in the Hunter Ridge shooting. Following his arrest, Anthony wouldn't say anything to detectives Garrison and Michael Giglio, which of course was his right, and he asked to speak to an attorney before saying anything further. The detectives had been careful not to mention anything to Anthony about the murders at this stage. As far as Anthony knew, they were only interested in the unsolved shootings from March, and they wanted to see what he would say. Someone who did talk to the investigators, though, was Anthony's girlfriend, Media Thompson. She had been driving the car when Anthony was arrested during that traffic stop. Media told officers the couple had been dating for about 3.5 years. While they didn't live together, Anthony often visited Media at her place. And guess where that was? In apartment 105D at the Archdale Forest apartment complex, the same exact complex where Deanna, Diane, and Jatavius lived and were found murdered. Is this a coincidence or something more? When asked if she knew anything that happened related to the triple murder, Media said that on the night of the murders, Anthony came over to visit her, but he didn't stay the whole evening. He left her place around 10 p.m., and police realized that upon Media giving them her address, this wasn't just the same building where Deanna's body had been found, because Xavier didn't match the description that Reginald had previously given. He had dreadlocks, not closely cropped short hair. At this same time, Detective Tim Morgan was analyzing Anthony and Xavier's cell phone records from July 6th through the 12th. Xavier's phone was turned off from 10:30 p.m. on July 9th, the night before the shootings, until 8:46 a.m. on July 10th. So, all through the night, Xavier's phone was not on, but Anthony's phone records showed multiple brief calls during the early morning hours of July 10th, with not much of a gap in between. He made a call at 2:05 a.m., then someone called him a minute later. The next outgoing call from Anthony's cell was at 2:24 a.m. to his girlfriend Media. You might recall that I mentioned that 2:24 a miss. the time that the first 911 call came in after the shootings at 2:25 a.m. Anthony called a female friend of his, Shayla, who lived in a nearby Goose Creek apartment building. They spoke for about 18 minutes. Anthony made another call at 3:24 a Monteau, a teenage girl that he knew, who we're going to call Sasha. She lived out in Roro, Virginia, but she had lived in North Charleston back in 2006, a year before the murders. At that time, she had only been 14 years old, and she was in a relationship with Anthony back then, who was 10 years older than her. That's interesting considering Deanna was also 14. Anthony had been charged with kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct with a minor in June of 2006 over his involvement with Sasha, but the charges were eventually dismissed. This, of course, piqued the detective's interest. When Detective Garrison went to Virginia to interview Sasha, she said she was actually surprised to get a call from Anthony in the middle of the night. He didn't sound like himself, and during the conversation he kept repeating that he needed to get out of South Carolina, calling himself AUP, his words. Sasha said this was very unlike the man that she knew. Anthony also told Sasha that he'd been kicked out of the Anchor Bar before a shooting had occurred. There were no phone numbers connected to the victims in the DeVore family in either Anthony's or Xavier's phone records. The closest cell tower to the apartment complex was a tower called number 6040, located on Trade Street. This was directly behind Festival Center Mall, which was less than a mile from Diane's apartment building. Detective Morgan could see that calls from Anthony's cell from 1:38 a.m. to 2:26 a.m. and pinged off of Tower 6040. As more phone calls were made from his cell phone between 2:26 a.m. and 2:35 a.m., the phone pinged off of a tower called 6139, which is located on Yolanda Drive. Then at 2:36 a.m. his phone pinged off both towers, 6139 and 6024, at Ashley River Road. These latter towers were ones en route from the apartment complex to the area where Anthony's mom lived in the Forest Hills neighborhood. Based on the cell and ballistics evidence, in conjunction with Xavier naming Anthony as a possible suspect, a search warrant was executed on Anthony's apartment. He lived on Popperdam Creek Drive in North Charleston. All detectives knew for sure so far was that he was linked to the murder weapon and the general area of Archdale Forest at the time of the murders, and not whether he was the one who actually pulled the trigger in the slayings. You'll remember I said that the gel lifts from the shoe impressions at the scene were Nike Air Force Ones. Investigators recovered 3 pairs of Nike Air Force One sneakers from Anthony's bedroom, which he shared with his twin brother, Tony. Is it weird? Because I thought it was odd that the twins were named Anthony and Tony because it's basically the same name. It's just a thought that crossed my mind. The men slept in single beds, one on each side of the room, and in between there were stacks of about 10 shoe boxes lined up against the wall. The sneakers ranged in sizes from 9 to 11. But also, inside this bedroom, law enforcement found a black Converse shoebox containing ammunition for a .32 caliber Derringer, as well as 3 Federal brand .40 caliber Smith & Wesson bullets, the same caliber and make as the shell casings from the Anchor Bar and the Hunter Ridge shootings and the triple homicide. Kind of interesting. Then under Anthony's bed was that .32 caliber Derringer itself and a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casing manufactured by a company called RP. Investigators also found a safe next to Anthony's bed, and inside were the usual things you would expect to find: photographs, letters, but there was also an arrest warrant and a newspaper clipping from July 12th, which included the story about the brutal DeVore family triple murder. Okay, that's super suspicious. There were also letters from Sasha, but there was no sign of an actual murder weapon. Detective Garrison then interviewed Anthony's twin brother, Tony, about Anthony's whereabouts on the night of the triple murder. Tony stated that Anthony had stayed with his girlfriend, Media. He came home briefly around 11 p.m., but he said he later left to go back over to Media's apartment. Tony knew Anthony hadn't come home because Tony had been awake all night and he hadn't seen his brother. When police quizzed Anthony about where the .40 caliber handgun was, he denied ever owning any firearms. That's when Detective Garrison hit Anthony with the news that if he didn't tell them where the weapon was, he would be charged with 3 counts of murder. They knew he was lying because they found ammunition and a firearm at his house. Again, Anthony shut down. He refused to answer any of their questions without speaking to his attorney. We actually don't see this that often, and I would expect this because it's a right to remain silent, but many people don't use that right. By now, the DNA samples from Deanna's clothing and her body had been run through CODIS, the national DNA database, to see if there were any matches to any known offenders, and there weren't. However, DNA from samples taken from Deanna's pajama pants revealed a mixed profile from 2 individuals, and investigators hoped that they would soon be able to get a DNA sample from Anthony. What was so atypical about this whole investigation was that instead of a particular suspect being identified first and then cross-checking the forensic evidence, it was the forensic evidence of the gun casings themselves that had led them to Anthony. It was a little bit backwards. On August 2nd, Anthony was charged with the murders of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna, but the murder weapon was still missing, and answers as to how Anthony even knew his victims and what his motive was remained unclear. In terms of an alibi, a police affidavit stated that Anthony claimed he was at home on the evening in question, though he later stated he hadn't said this at all. But when Anthony was being escorted to court for his bond hearing, he asked Detective Garrison out of the blue if he'd like to have the gun that was involved in the killings. Detective Garrison obviously said yes, to which Anthony cryptically replied, "One day, I'll tell you what happened." Anthony's bond was denied, and he then remained in custody. Diane's surviving son, Marquise, was incredibly relieved to hear that someone had been charged and was off the streets, but now a different sort of waiting game began until Anthony would have his day in court. It was too early to tell whether a conviction was likely, and the investigation was still ongoing. The day after Anthony was charged, on August 3rd, Detective Garrison interviewed a man named Richard Alexander. Richard had come in to report that his Smith & Wesson semi-automatic .40 caliber handgun and some loose rounds in an ammunition can had been stolen. He told Detective Garrison that in January of 2007, prior to the March shootings, he'd purchased these items, which he kept in the seat of his black Chevy pickup truck. Richard had first noticed his gun and ammo were gone from his pickup in the days following the murders, and he had what he described as a bad feeling, but he didn't report them stolen until now. He had no idea how long these items had actually been gone, but it was definitely before the murders. Richard told Detective Garrison that a friend of his, who happened to be named Anthony Sanders, who Richard knew had been charged with the crime, borrowed his pickup truck all the time. Anthony, it turns out, was actually Richard's drug dealer, and they had an agreement that if Anthony wanted, sometimes he could give Richard drugs, and in return, Richard would allow him to do things, like bring women to his apartment, where he could have sex with them in one of his bedrooms, or borrow his truck in exchange for drugs. Now, officers didn't seize a can of ammunition in the original search of Anthony's apartment, and they couldn't even recall seeing one. But when they looked back at photographs that they took in Anthony's bedroom, they saw a can matching the description of the one that Richard said had been stolen. So a second search warrant was executed, and they seized this can. Now Richard couldn't say it was the exact same one that he was missing, but it definitely looked like it. Richard also told Detective Garrison that following the triple murder, Anthony had actually asked him if he knew anything about DNA. Richard told Anthony that police can get DNA from saliva, blood, or semen, to which Anthony then asked him whether it would matter if a condom had been used. Then the conversation ended, and Richard was left wondering whether Anthony might have committed some kind of sex offense. If that's not telling, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, detectives went back to the Archdale Forest apartments with a picture of Anthony to see if any of Deanna's neighbors would recognize him. Not only did some of the neighbors recognize Anthony, but they told officers that they'd seen him prior to the murders talking to Deanna while she was hanging out with her friends in the area. It seems like this is all starting to come together. On August 30th, Anthony was indicted by a Dorchester County grand jury for 3 counts of murder. The charges against his friend Xavier over the Hunter Ridge shooting were dropped in exchange for Xavier's cooperation. Of course, Anthony pleaded not guilty, and he was actually facing the death penalty if he got convicted. From what investigators could tell from his upbringing, Anthony did come from a really tough background, and while he had family around him, including his mother, Patty, and his sister, his older brothers were said to be a bad influence. Anthony had been close to his mother, but she sadly passed away suddenly the year before from complications following childbirth. But despite these struggles, Anthony was said to be doing the best he could on his own with his young son, and it seemed like he truly wanted to maintain a healthy relationship with him and be a present father. It was his mother's passing that made Anthony realize he needed to step it up and be an active part of his son's life. But it wasn't long before Anthony began abusing drugs and alcohol. In addition to drinking heavily, Anthony was involved in experimenting with psychotropic drugs, including ecstasy and dealing crack. In the meantime, Anthony's DNA had been collected, and it had been tested against what was found on Deanna's body, her pajama pants, as well as the front doorknob of the apartment. SLED agent Katie Coy identified a partial DNA profile obtained from the semen of Deanna's oral swabs that matched Anthony. The match was around 1 in 260, meaning there was only a 1 in 260 chance that the DNA belonged to Anthony. So this wasn't as encouraging as investigators might have hoped for, because in many criminal cases, DNA results are usually much more significant. At the time, SLED-D didn't conduct DNA testing for male profiles using this test called a YST test, which identifies the Y chromosome. So the sample was sent to be run by another lab, a private lab. However, he was excluded as a contributor for the semen that was detected on Deanna's pajama pants, as well as the DNA found on the apartment doorknob. That makes things confusing, but I think it's safe to say that he had an encounter with Deanna, and it doesn't appear to have been consensual. Then she ended up dead from a weapon he was in possession of. On July 16, 2008, First Circuit Solicitor David Pascoe announced that the state would be pursuing the death penalty. By now, the solicitor's office had established aggravating circumstances that justified the sentence in Anthony's case. He killed more than one person and had committed these murders in conjunction with a burglary and criminal sexual conduct. The latter offense was well established by the presence of Anthony's DNA on the oral swabs. The public still didn't know what happened to Deanna, beyond David Pascoe just saying that it was absolutely horrendous. Still, there was no mention of a motive. The announcement about the death penalty gave Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones a pause. A cousin of the family, Chantel Miller, who had always been opposed to the death penalty, now said it hit so close to home and was so personal that she's had a lot to process. She said if he's found guilty, she wouldn't be against the death penalty. Yes, people do change their minds when something happens to them or someone they love. It makes you look at things differently. By now, the first anniversary of the murders had come and gone. Chantel and another cousin, Nan Ballard, visited the graves of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna to plant a rose bush and tie 3 balloons to Deanna's grave in honor of her 16th birthday, which she would have celebrated that month. Pre-trial hearings didn't even get underway until over a year later, in November 2009. The prosecution now offered to forego the death penalty in exchange for a plea, which would carry the reduced sentence of life in prison without parole. Anthony initially seemed to think this was going to be something he was going to go along with, but at the last minute, the man changed his mind. At a subsequent hearing, a status conference had significant implications on how Anthony's trial would unfold. The state was now offering not to pursue the death penalty in exchange for Anthony waiving his rights to a jury trial. If a judge found Anthony guilty, he was instead looking at 30 years to life in prison for each indictment. Sometimes I do get mad when these kinds of deals are offered, but this course of action was initiated in consultation with Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's family. They knew that even if Anthony were found guilty, the appeal process would be so long, and it just wasn't something that they thought they could handle. It could go on for decades. So fair enough. Even though this might sound like a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of avoiding the death penalty, a bench trial isn't without risks. Instead of a jury, an accused person may encounter a judge who is known for a high rate of convictions or harsh sentences. Unlike when you have a jury trial, the judge is privy to every single piece of evidence. You know how sometimes in cases we get frustrated because certain things are held back from the jury, and we're like, I wish they would have known that? Well, the judge would. As far as Anthony's attorneys were concerned, they felt a bench trial was in his best interest. A lot of times it's really hard to find potential jurors who are opposed to the death penalty. Anthony's attorneys also thought a bench trial would be better for their client, given the weakness, in their opinion, of the DNA evidence. They felt like a judge would be able to assess this aspect of the case better than a jury would. So Anthony's attorneys signed what they call a waiver, and Anthony was questioned by the judge during a very lengthy hearing. He was asked things like whether he understood this waiver. He said he did. He was willing to sign it to avoid the death penalty, so it was approved. Now, 28-year-old Anthony's trial got underway on March 8, 2010, so many years later, at the Dorchester County Courthouse in St. George. He stood before Circuit Judge R. Markley Dennis, Jr. The prosecution's case was presented, and it was that in the early morning hours of July 9, 2007, Anthony, who was armed with a handgun, gained access to the DeVore family's apartment with the sole intent of forcing Dina to engage in a sex act. They believe she was forced to take off her pajama bottoms and her underwear at gunpoint and proceeded to give him oral sex. But at some point, before intercourse could begin, Diane and Jatavius either arrived home or were already in the apartment and were awoken. Anthony was most likely caught off guard, and to eliminate any threat to him, he shot Jatavius in the face. Then, as Diane ran for the door, Anthony shot her in the back of the head. It is just disgusting to think about Deanna having just witnessed her mother and her brother being murdered. She ran from the apartment barefoot, clutching her pajama pants and her underwear, and as she fled, Anthony chased her down. It just so happened he caught up to her right in the back of his own girlfriend's apartment, where he then shot the teen dead. After Deanna fell to the ground, Anthony shot her 3 more times before fleeing the area, calling his girlfriend Media as he drove away. I cannot even begin to imagine how absolutely terrifying this must have been for Deanna. Not only had she just been violated, but she witnessed the murder of her mother and brother. She was desperately trying to get away. The sheer terror that she must have experienced is unimaginable, and it's unthinkable to me that a man would kill a young girl over pleasure. But it's so common, as most of you know. It's just disgusting, and it doesn't even matter that Anthony had a girlfriend that he could have easily had sexual relations with. That's not the point. They want what they can't have. They enjoy the chase and forcing women into these unspeakable things, all in the name of control and getting off. It's beyond me how their brains work. The state was open about the fact that there were no eyewitnesses or any solid evidence that Anthony had previously known Diane, Jatavius, or Deanna. The prosecution's case against Anthony was purely circumstantial, but this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Circumstantial evidence can be both powerful and compelling. The evidence in its totality was what pointed to Anthony's guilt. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the 15-minute period when no calls were made or received on his cell phone just before the murders, with the prosecutor saying that it cannot be explained away as a coincidence that there's no phone activity while all these other actions are going on. Anthony's sneakers were the same size and type as the shoe impressions, and the bullets found in his home matched in caliber and brand with the shell casings found at the scene. But the most condemning piece of evidence of all was what was in Anthony's safe. If he wasn't guilty, there was no explanation for him to have saved a newspaper article about the triple homicide. It was a memento. The other items in the safe, such as photographs and letters, were also little mementos of his previous crimes. Anthony also had ample opportunity to steal the gun from his friend Richard, whose pickup truck he regularly borrowed, and the shell casing in his bedroom matched the ones found at the Anchor Bar shooting with which Anthony had been connected. One of the pieces of evidence on the side of the defense, though, was that none of Anthony's sneakers could be definitively matched to the shoe impression found at the scene. While the sneakers were the same size and type as the ones that left the impressions, SLED agent Vicky Hinton found the gel lifts were consistent with all Nike Air Force One sneakers of that type and size. Basically, what she testified was that Air Force Ones, or sneakers with similar tread design, accounted for about 95% of her cases. It was a very popular shoe type, so the defense said it wasn't conclusive as to whether Anthony's shoes were the ones that left those impressions. The defense also said that the fact that the DNA from Deanna's oral swabs wasn't a high statistical match was another aspect of reasonable doubt. The fact that investigators didn't appear to pursue Xavier as aggressively as they did Anthony was also raised, but Xavier had been subsequently charged and denied bond in another murder that occurred after Anthony was arrested. That being said, the defense claimed that this was inadequate investigation, and Anthony chose not to testify in his defense. On March 9th, Judge Dennis found Anthony guilty of all 3 counts of murder. Before he was sentenced, Diane's cousin, Carolina Anderson, addressed the court. She gave a moving statement as to the anguish and pain the murders left in their wake, saying, "I'd like to speak on behalf of the Grant family and the DeVore family. This was a family that never bothered anyone. I knew Diane, we worked together for the past 9.5 years of her life, and I really got to know her. She made sure she got the job done. Regardless, the boss could tell her things, and there was nothing that she would say. She would walk away, she wouldn't harm a fly. She was always a sweet, kind, loving person, very quiet. She loved to laugh, and she loved to eat and have a good time with her family. Deanna helped me with being able to read and go on with school. Deanna was a sweetheart. I don't understand why these things happen, and I know that God's will has to be done. I assume that this was God's way of saying, come on home, but the way that it was done, we may never know what or why. All we can do is ask that you bring justice. I didn't just lose a first cousin and a co-worker, I lost a good friend. This is a tight-knit family. Diane was so happy-go-lucky. For the first time in her life, she was going to meet her brother, whom she had never seen before. I thank God he spared his children. The Marquise wasn't around. No matter what you say here today, it won't bring them back. But if some justice can be served on behalf of this, our family can get closure. We will really appreciate it, and you do what you have to do, but we appreciate what you do, and ask for justice for our family." The prosecutor asked for Anthony to be sentenced to nothing less than the maximum of 30 years to life in prison without parole, emphasizing that Jatavius and Diane had both been shot at close range, in the face and then in the back of the head. Judge Dennis sentenced Anthony to life without parole on all 3 counts. The tipping point requiring the maximum sentence, according to the judge, was Anthony chasing Deanna down. She had been hunted down like an animal. After she fled the apartment, she ran into the night, desperately hoping someone would come to her rescue. But before they could, she was murdered and left out in the open for hours without dignity. Anthony had nothing to say during the sentencing. As far as the prosecution, the defense, and the victims' families were concerned, there were still no definite answers as to how Anthony knew this family or what his motive was. But I think we can kind of put 2 and 2 together based on the available evidence. The prosecution and the investigators believe that Anthony, seeing Deanna around the complex when he was there visiting his girlfriend, Media, had run into Deanna and possibly even struck up a conversation in the weeks leading up to her death. She was very outgoing. We know that much. But Anthony had bad intentions. He decided he wanted her and nothing was going to stop him. The more he saw her around, the stronger his urge grew, and finally, the night he was over at Media's, the urge was just too strong. In the early morning hours of July 10th, Anthony knocked on the front door of Diane's apartment. At that point, Diane and Jatavius weren't home, and maybe he knew this by having walked the apartment in the weeks leading up to the murders. But Deanna was home. She was babysitting her niece and nephew, who were already safely tucked into their beds. So Deanna opened that front door, and Anthony threatened her at gunpoint. He forced his way inside and subjected a terrified Deanna to a forced sexual act upstairs. Then her mother and brother arrived home. Anthony went back downstairs and first shot and killed Jatavius and then Diane. We know Deanna then fled downstairs, half naked at the front door, holding her pajama pants and underwear before Anthony chased her down and shot her behind Building 105. We know that Deanna not only tried to escape, but in leaving the house, she led Anthony outside, away from her niece and nephew, who were peacefully sleeping upstairs. In doing so, she saved their lives. We don't know what this man would have done. Anthony did attempt to appeal based on grounds of ineffective counsel, but this was dismissed almost 8 months later. On January 6, 2011, Anthony filed for an application for post-conviction relief. This was also dismissed, but this did not deter Anthony. He applied to the Supreme Court of South Carolina in June of 2015, and the court granted him an evidentiary hearing in October of 2018, which wasn't that long ago. The court found that Anthony did in fact receive ineffective assistance of counsel. At this point, he said he would have never signed that waiver. He only signed it because his attorneys told him it wasn't enforceable. I don't know why they would tell him that, but this is what he claimed. Now, due to the impact of the pandemic at the time, it resulted in so many backlogs in the court system that this evidentiary hearing wasn't held until 2 years later, in 2021. It was then more than another 2 years before the First Judicial Circuit Court granted Anthony a belated direct appeal, despite finding that Anthony knowingly and involuntarily waived his right to a jury trial. However, his request for a new trial was denied. In March of this year, 2024, Anthony appealed his conviction. He claimed the evidence merely raised a suspicion that he was involved in the murders and not that he committed them, and therefore this is grounds for an acquittal and a new trial. At the time of recording this, the South Carolina Court of Appeals has yet to issue a ruling. And of course, this gives me chills in a bad way. 41-year-old Anthony continues to reside at the Lee Correctional Institute in South Carolina, and I cannot imagine the ongoing pain, uncertainty, and anguish that this is causing all of this family's loved ones. Instead of being able to move through their overwhelming grief and process the loss day to day, they're now facing not just the possibility that Anthony may be acquitted and even ordered a new trial, but if he's again found guilty, he may receive the death penalty. A sentence that the DeVore and Grant families never wanted to begin with. This will trigger years and years of further appeals. But this is our legal system, and I do respect it nonetheless. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's families understandably remain shattered to this day over the loss of 3 people whom they loved very deeply. Deanna's heroism in making that split-second decision to flee the apartment after being violated in the most intimate way possible saved the lives of her niece and nephew. This is a testament to the kind of selfless person she was and how far she would go to protect her family, values which were instilled in her by her mother and her older brothers. Marquise and his wife Sonia know that Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna live on, and how Diane's grandchildren are being raised in a way that honors the closeness, warmth, and unconditional love that Marquise will never forget as being the heart and soul of his mother's home. A college town, a paradise for young people. Everywhere, students are studying for exams, hanging out with friends, going on dates and throwing house parties, fully immersed in life. But what happens when a predator hides in the shadows, ready to steal away everything you've worked so hard to build? Today's case is a bit unique because I'm not going to be focusing on 1 or 2, but 3 women who were targeted by pure evil. Someone who was intent on getting what they wanted and leaving destruction in their path. First, I want to go back in time to introduce you to the beautiful, vibrant, and lovable Jamie Glenda Hart. Jamie was born on November 14, 1977 in Normandy, Missouri. It's one of the suburbs of St. Louis, a large metropolitan area in Missouri. Her parents are James and Lana Hart, known to friends as Jim and Donna. Donna already had 2 girls with her previous partner, who also lived in the St. Louis area. Jamie's older sisters were Victoria, who went by Vicky, and Lisa. It can be really tough to adjust to both of your parents having new partners, but for Vicky and Lisa, it was such a blessing to have a younger sister. Jamie spent the first years of her life surrounded by loved ones in St. Louis, and only a few years later, Donna welcomed another bundle of joy. Catherine, known to everyone as Katie. She was the youngest of the bunch, and since Jamie and Katie were close in age, they became inseparable. The entire family decided to move to Baytown, Texas, which is a small city with a population of about 88,000 people, just east of Houston. It's known for its oil and gas jobs through Chevron and ExxonMobil. There was a huge boom in oil in the 90s, so a lot of families moved there to obtain jobs in the oil industry. It's also super kid-friendly, close enough to the bay for beach days, and close enough to Houston for shopping, good restaurants, and nightlife. Jamie spent elementary school and high school working hard to get good grades and going to church every Sunday at the Cedar Bayou Baptist Church. She was incredibly intelligent and one of those very naturally independent, hard-working people. Jamie was one of those people truly set on making the world a better place. As she got older, her sisters grew up, went to college, and got married. Of course, Jamie dreamed of getting out of Baytown. Her older stepsister Vicky stayed in Baytown and got married to a man named Eric Harris, with whom she had kids. Her other stepsister Lisa moved to Seattle, Washington. Jamie went to high school at Robert E. Lee High School and spent most of her 4 years in French club and the drum and bugle corps. They performed all over the place, even at Disney World and the Orange Bowl. By the time she was a senior, several of her friends were applying for their associate degrees at Lee College and Houston Community College, but not Jamie, because she wanted to go to a state school. Jamie got into 2 schools, the University of Texas and Texas A&M. Now, she had to choose. She had to decide. The University of Texas gave her a generous scholarship, which she was pretty excited about, but then there was Texas A&M, and that had been her dream school for years. Not only did it have an excellent biomedical engineering program, which is what she wanted to go into, but the school spirit was unmatched. I didn't know much about Texas A&M, so let me tell you, it starts with the traditions. Football is huge. The fans will stand throughout the entire football game in solidarity with the players. There are yell leaders who are in charge of chanting at every game, and they even have an annual midnight yell practice. Fraternity and sorority life is huge. It's the South, and it's a big tradition in many families. I haven't even gotten started on their sort of obsession with class rings. Do you remember class rings? I got suckered into buying one when I was in college. They are a bit overpriced, but for many people, there's something very special and memorable about them. They signify their accomplishments, especially for students at Texas A&M, who are referred to as Aggies, representing A&M's agricultural roots. The A&M in Texas A&M's name stands for agricultural and mechanical, and these class rings encompass the college experience. You can actually identify any Texas A&M alumni by their ring. Jamie wanted, more than anything, to be part of the Aggie community. Not only was it a lot of fun, but once you were part of the Texas A&M family, you got to participate in all of their ceremonies, so it was an easy decision. Jamie felt that Texas A&M was where she was meant to be. She was so excited when she went to her freshman orientation with her dad. Texas A&M is located in an area called College Station, which is about 2 hours away from Jamie's home in Baytown. Of course, she was going to miss her family, but now she'd gotten her first taste of freedom. She told her dad she would never move back home to Baytown. College Station was the place to be. In the late 90s, when Texas A&M was first founded in the 1800s, College Station wasn't even really a town. It was just a train stop, and it got that name, College Station, because that's what it was, a train stop at a station located to the west of the campus. But in 1996, when Jamie started her freshman year, it had grown so big that it touched the nearest city of Bryan. Both towns had a population of around 60,000 people, so combined together, Brazos County was a decent-sized metropolitan area. Today, because so many alumni and football fans have stayed in this area, College Station has a population of a whopping 120,000 people, including the students, and the city of Bryan has a population of 90,000. So it's safe to say there are a lot of people either going in and out of these towns or living there. When the students are gone, College Station and Bryan are ghost towns, but when they're present, the area comes alive. It's a college town in every sense of the word and has been dubbed Aggie Land, a safe, fun area with coffee shops, events like farmers markets, art shows, and fraternity and sorority members going on dates, partying, going to local bars. Think of a college town. That's exactly what it's like. For the first 2 years that Jamie was in college, her father actually helped her out with her housing expenses and her tuition. They were super close. They would call each other every day, and Jim would even drive to College Station regularly, and Jamie would come home for holidays and even parts of her summer break. She would tell her family all about her new friends and eventually her new boyfriend, Chuck Cruz. When Chuck laid eyes on Jamie for the first time, it was like love at first sight. He was head over heels. He described it as if it were the Wizard of Oz. Everything was completely black and white, and then, all of a sudden, when he saw Jamie for the first time, his world was in full color. Chuck was 3 years older than Jamie, but that was a good thing because it meant that he was a little more mature. Still, he was a little shy, nerdy, but very smart with a stable job. He had long hair at the time, which definitely set him apart from the cowboy-type guys in fraternities. She and Chuck started dating pretty soon after they met, and before they knew it, they were in a very serious relationship. Jamie ended up introducing Chuck to her parents. Jamie did have a lot of boyfriends in high school, and in her first couple of years of college before meeting Chuck, there was no lack of men trying to get her attention. She was what many would think is the epitome of a Southern girl, with the bright blonde hair, the big white smile, and the sparkling blue eyes. She also loved fashion. She was always wearing something stylish, like long, dangling earrings. And as a friend, Jamie was loyal, outgoing, and had a great sense of humor. She got along with everyone, but she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She was honest, almost to a fault. She would say anything that came to her mind. When she went through breakups, there was actually rarely any drama. She remained friends with all her exes. She never really thought of any of her exes as having bad intentions. She still valued them as people, they just weren't right for her. But that didn't mean they couldn't remain in her life as friends. Chuck was convinced that he was going to stick it out for the long haul and that they would be together forever. Junior year, college bills were starting to catch up, and Jamie no longer had the support of her father. This was because Jamie's younger sister, Katie, was now in college, so Jim was trying to help her out as the youngest daughter. That meant Jamie was on her own, so she decided it was time to take a break from her studies to work and save up some money. The summer before her junior year, she had decided to find a place where she could live and split the rent with roommates. She chose a cute little 2-story, 3-bedroom townhouse on a quaint cul-de-sac, only 6 minutes from A&M, at 701 Chalet Court on the corner of Welsh Avenue. She would get her own room and share the house with 2 roommates. They were both guys. Their names were Jake Carr and Cody Lemons. When Jamie first signed that lease for the year, she had every intention of continuing her classes. However, it didn't take long for her to realize, like many of us do when we become adults and take on a lot of responsibilities of our own, that she was finding it hard to pay both her rent and her tuition. So midway through her junior year, Jamie had to put A&M on hold. It was the spring of 1999, when Jamie would have been in her second semester of her junior year. Instead, she was now working full-time as a delivery driver for Papa John's Pizza. Now, just because Jamie had taken a break from her studies did not mean she'd given up on her dream of becoming a biomedical engineer. She was still keeping up with all of her readings that the professors had assigned to her friends who were still in their engineering classes. Jamie wanted that Aggie ring. It was just going to have to be postponed until she could make ends meet. Working at Papa John's was actually a nice brain break for Jamie, and she really liked it there. Her co-workers were all around her age, 21, and many people make friends where they work in the restaurant industry, especially so. When Jamie wasn't already hanging out with Chuck, she spent a lot of her time with her coworkers. After work, they would go out on the town, grab a bite to eat, or go watch some movies until the early morning hours. She was a night owl. She liked to stay out and stay up late. I want to take you to April 30th of that year, 1999. Jamie had a normal day at work. She delivered pizzas all over College Station and parts of the neighboring city of Bryan until her shift ended a little after midnight on May 1st. One of her coworkers invited her to go watch movies with him after their shift got done. I'm going to call him Adam for the purposes of the story. Adam lived at Pierre Place, a 6-minute drive from Jamie's house, and this was completely not unusual. As I mentioned before, Jamie was close with her coworkers, guys or gals, and this would have been typical for her. Jamie went over there, they hung out, watched a movie or two, and she left Adam's house at 4:30 in the morning. She liked to stay out late. This was normal for her, especially when she didn't have a shift the next day. She walked outside of Adam's place, hopped in her light blue 1987 Chevy Celebrity, and took off for home. Remember, this was 1999. Only about 20% of people owned a cell phone, and even then, I'm sure you will remember they were those big clunky Nokias. There was no text me when you get home. No one had a clue that when the sun came up, Jamie would be missing. Early the next morning, Saturday, May 1st, Jamie's roommates were starting to get worried. They had not seen her car parked outside, which meant she hadn't come home the night before. At first, they thought maybe she spent the night at Chuck's without telling them, but Jamie always let someone know about her plans. Everyone assumed Jamie would be back home after movie night at Adam's. Jamie's roommate Jake called Chuck and asked, "Did Jamie stay at your place last night?" Chuck was getting ready for work by that time, and he said no, he'd been alone most of the night. Then Jake asked if Chuck knew where Jamie was. Chuck said he had no idea. He hadn't seen her at all on April 30th or even the day before, on April 29th, for that matter. They hadn't talked that whole time, and I couldn't help but think that was a little suspicious. I think Jake thought that too. They were in a serious relationship, so they would go a couple of days without talking. But either way, Chuck sounded concerned. He told Jake if Jamie didn't turn up soon, they should actually call the police. Even though it was a Saturday, Chuck had work, so he hung up and got on his way. The thing is, around 7:15 that same morning, the Brazos County Sheriff's Department received a distraught call from a woman who said that she was on her routine daily early morning jog when she saw what appeared to be the lifeless body of a woman lying in a ditch at the side of the street just outside the city of Bryan, about 9 feet off of Old Reliance Road near Highway 6. Officer James Hall was dispatched to the scene. He was a rookie cop at the time, but when he saw what the jogger reported, he knew that this wasn't an accident. Even though this was his very first homicide case, what struck him was how young she was. It was a very disturbing sight, and he immediately radioed for assistance. 5 additional officers showed up on the scene and confirmed his suspicions that this was a homicide. So homicide detective Kenny Elliott was sent to investigate. By the time he arrived, traffic had been blocked and the crime scene had been cordoned off with crime scene tape. He approached and his heart sank. He saw the body of a young woman with blonde hair collapsed in a heap on the ground. He realized why the officers assumed this was a homicide. She was not wearing any clothes, and there was road rash all over her body. It looked like she had been thrown from a fast-moving vehicle. As he got closer, he could tell that she had also been struck in the face and head a number of times. There was blood, lots of it, from abrasions that she had sustained in the fall and injuries to her face and head. At this point, from merely the preliminary examination, it was not readily apparent what caused the young woman to die, but Detective Elliott began looking around the immediate vicinity for clues. He figured there could be some indication of how she had ended up in that ditch. Where were her clothes? Did she have a purse? Any form of identification? Not long after Elliott began to walk around the area, he got a message over his radio that a deputy patrolling on Old Reliance Road discovered something less than a mile away. so he was called out to take a look. When Detective Elliott arrived, he designated this second area as another crime scene. All of the young woman's clothes were strewn across a gravel area at the entrance of a remote oil field. The clothes were not just dumped out all at once. Instead, they were scattered individually in a way that looked as though they had been removed quickly, one by one, in the middle of a struggle. There was a blue t-shirt crumpled on the gravel road that was stretched out at the collar, with some stains on it that looked like they could be blood. There was also dirt all over it. A leopard-patterned bra was lying on top. It was ripped between the two cups. Then, in another pile not too far away, was a pair of blue jeans with the underwear still inside. They had a lot of dirt from the gravel on the buttocks area, as well as the legs, and it appeared as though someone had been dragged across the gravel while they were still on. Right next to them was one brown leather strappy sandal. The other was a few feet away, lying by itself. It appeared there could have been some blood on the clothing, and all of the items were near an overturned, ripped, flowered love seat. It didn't appear to have anything to do with the crime scene. It looked like someone had dumped it there sometime before this, and it was left there to be picked up by a local garbage service, but it hadn't been. All the clothing was collected to be processed for DNA evidence. Detective Elliott noticed there were clear signs of a struggle at the oil field, and that her clothing was removed in the process. It was apparent that she had not willingly gotten back into that vehicle. She had been thrown from it when she was taken to the location where she was found in the ditch. Her lack of clothing was a textbook sign of sexual assault by a male perpetrator. What Detective Elliott didn't know was who this woman was and whether she had been kidnapped by a stranger and dumped here, or whether she had been with someone she knew and something went awry. Then, after the struggle, was she pushed out of the passenger side door of the car, or did she jump in an attempt to escape? The first order of business was finding out this woman's identity. She was transported to the Brazos County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. Meanwhile, Detective Elliott and other members of the Sheriff's Department looked over Old Reliance Road and then into College Station for the rest of the morning. They were hoping to find some clue to identify their Jane Doe. Around 9:30 a.m., they had a breakthrough in the investigation. An abandoned car had been found sitting right in the middle of the southbound lane at approximately 1707 Welsh Avenue. Now, I've mapped the location because I really do like to get a visual of every area where evidence is found. This was a little less than 9 miles away from where this young woman's body was found, but only 3 blocks from Jamie's townhouse. However, Detective Elliott didn't know the significance of this location at the time, since he had no idea who the young woman was or whose car was left in the middle of this road. It was a light blue, 4-door Chevy Celebrity. The lights were still on, the keys were still in the ignition, and surprisingly, the engine was still running. That would have been a pretty odd sight to see. Both of the front windows, the driver and passenger side, were open just a few inches. On the back window of this car, there was a Texas A&M University sticker across the top, and a sticker from the band Prodigy in the bottom middle of the glass. On the far left, there was a sticker with a red lowercase e. Since it was abandoned, Detective Elliott didn't need a warrant, and they really wanted to get inside because they found what appeared to be some blood on the outside of the car. It was near the driver's side, on the front hood, above the left headlight. That's definitely not a good sign. They believed this vehicle was connected to the deceased woman. Once they were able to get inside the car, they found a driver's license with the name Jamie Hart and a photo that undeniably matched the description of the woman they had found. They ran the VIN, and it confirmed it was Jamie's car, so it was taken in for forensic processing. They were able to get Jamie's address from her driver's license, and that's when it became apparent that this car was found only 3 blocks from her house. At this point, there were so many questions. Was Jamie a college student? Had she been kidnapped in her own car? Had she been kidnapped from her house, her school, or somewhere she worked? Was this even a kidnapping? With the car's proximity so close to her house, police thought that maybe she had been kidnapped from there or somewhere nearby. The place where the body was found was only 9 miles away, which meant they hadn't gotten far before Jamie had been attacked. So was there a connection to where the body had been found? These were the things they needed to figure out. They went to Jamie's front door and met with her roommates. When Jake saw the police, his worst fears were confirmed. His friend, his roommate since August, was dead. He would never get to hear her laugh or her voice again. Jake told the police that Jamie was very savvy. She was aware and cautious. She would never put herself in harm's way, and was pretty street smart, considering they lived in a college town where murders weren't the norm. So he did not understand how this could happen. When he was informed that they believed they found her and she was deceased, he was in shock. He kept telling them she would have never put herself in a dangerous situation unless she had no control over it. Detective Elliot asked him if she had any enemies, and Jake was adamant that everyone loved Jamie. Jamie's other roommate, Coach Cody, said that Jamie was always happy. She was one of those people that, even if she was having a bad day, she would find a way to joke about it. She always made the best of everything, and they just could not understand how this could happen, especially in their college town. Well, of course, that's what detectives want to know as well. This was not common in a town like this, and they knew that the news would break very soon. It would be hard to keep this tragedy a secret. So, Sheriff Chris Kirk, Elliot's supervisor, called Jamie's family in Baytown to give them news before they found out another way. It was around 10 a.m. Jim picked up the phone, and his heart broke. His daughter snatched away from him in an instant, and for what? Why would anyone do this? It just didn't seem real. It's a parent's worst nightmare. No one ever thinks they'll be preparing for their child's funeral, and not something like their college graduation or wedding. At this point, the autopsy results hadn't come back, so the police had very few details to share with Jim's family. But knowing that his daughter had been found without her clothing and that her last moments included a struggle and suffering sent Jim reeling. He didn't understand how this could happen, and he wanted answers. He wanted justice. Meanwhile, Detective Elliot had gone to Jamie's boyfriend Chuck's workplace, and Chuck knew as soon as the police arrived that something bad had happened to Jamie. He told them that he had been worried all morning, and he explained that he had been in a haze, wondering what had happened to her and why she hadn't been in contact with him. But he held on to hope that maybe she wasn't answering her phone because maybe she had just slept in late at a friend's house. However, when Chuck learned that his girlfriend had been killed, he said he felt like he'd been hit by a truck. He got in touch with Jamie's father as soon as he found out the news, and Jim didn't hesitate to invite Chuck to drive down to Baytown and spend the rest of the week with Jamie's family as they grieved together. Jamie's 3 sisters were there, and they spent the week telling stories about Jamie and trying to come to terms with this gigantic hole in their lives while they waited to get additional information about her killing. Her sisters remember when Jamie's mother came home with all of Jamie's belongings. She just sat on the floor with Jamie's brush in her hand, crying and crying. When Jamie's best friend received this news, she didn't believe it was true. She was unable to contain her sadness and shock. She had just asked Jamie to be in her January wedding. Now, she said through tears, that there would certainly be a void at the wedding without Jamie there. She called her a wonderful person, and she thought it was really scary that the authorities didn't know who did this, that someone was still walking around out there. To further their investigation, police began to canvass the neighborhood around Welsh Avenue where Jamie's car was found, and around Shell Court where she lived, to see if anyone had witnessed a kidnapping or seen someone park that Chevy early in the morning on the 1st. They talked to hundreds of people in College Station, hoping someone had seen something or heard a scream, but nobody said they were awake at the time, and they didn't hear or see anything. Authorities put out a call for tips in the paper, offering up to a $1,000 cash reward, and as usual, the tips came flooding in, which took a long time to process. The autopsy results were not released for quite a while, and in that time, The DNA results came back for the blood on Jamie's clothes and her car. It belonged to her. However, there were no fingerprints in that Chevy, so whoever had dropped off the car on Welsh Avenue had been careful not to leave a trace of evidence behind, unless it was Jamie herself, and then the car had been wiped afterward. They still had no clue how it got there. It could have been that Jamie had made it to that area right near her home after leaving Adams, and for some reason she stopped the car for a stranger, and that person ripped her from the car and put her in their own vehicle, and that's why it was still running. Or maybe Jamie never made it to this location at all. Maybe the person who assaulted her was someone she knew, and they took her from somewhere else and deliberately left her car right near her house to throw off the investigation. It could also be a mere coincidence that the car was found there. Many students live right in that same area, so maybe it was just abandoned close to where they lived so they could escape on foot and go back home as soon as possible. The investigation seemed to reach a dead end, at least as far as forensic evidence was concerned, until Jamie's autopsy came back. What they found is heartbreaking to talk about, knowing all the pain that this poor girl went through. It's probably not a surprise, considering we know that she was not clothed, but Jamie had been sexually violated, and the medical examiner found evidence of semen present on and in her body. She had road rash all over, and most of the scrapes and abrasions were on the back and front of her, as well as deep lacerations on both of her knees. Her skull had been fractured, and her neck dislocated. The medical examiner stated this could have occurred as a result of being thrown from a vehicle onto the road. This led to a brain injury and severe swelling to the point where she developed a secondary brainstem hemorrhage. The fact that the hemorrhage happened meant that she was alive for about 20 to 30 minutes after falling from the car, scared and alone in the dark, somewhere between the hours of 4:30, a man 7 o'clock in the morning. Her death was ruled a homicide, and whatever monster did this to her had to be brought to justice. Detective Elliott still had to wait a couple more weeks to see if the male DNA matched up to any existing criminals in his database, but it was 1999. So of course, there actually wasn't a huge catalog of people back then, but it did still take some time to process. This was the biggest news story. It was at the front of the newspapers in town. Everyone was on edge. Students no longer wanted to go out alone or at all, and everyone was hoping the person that did this was a drifter, someone that didn't live in College Station, and certainly not a fellow Aggie. They didn't want to think that any one of them would be capable of something like this. Detective Elliott began having serious sit-down conversations with all the people in Jamie's life. Jamie's roommates had solid alibis when they said Jamie had been at work that evening. Elliott went to the Papa John's, and it turns out Jamie had been a lot of places that night. Remember, she was a delivery driver, but Papa John's luckily had a catalog of all the addresses and telephone numbers of all the places Jamie had delivered pizza on Friday, May 30th. Detective Elliott canvassed all of those locations, hoping someone would see something that they thought was suspicious, or may have seen Jamie take a wrong turn or something. But Jamie hadn't stayed in one specific area that long, and most of those people had alibis. It was near finals time, and many students were having pizza study parties where they were cramming for their final papers and things like that. So Detective Elliott took DNA samples from anyone that was willing to give a sample until he felt like he'd ruled out all of Jamie's customers. In terms of Jamie's co-workers, like her roommate said, everyone adored her, and someone had overheard that she was going to Adams to watch a movie that night. Everyone said that she and Adam had been friends for a long time, and they would hang out frequently after work on a regular basis, so Elliott called Adam in for an interview. This man seemed to be seriously grieving. He told Detective Elliott what we already know, that Jamie stayed at his house to watch movies between about 1 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 a.m. But when Elliott asked Adam for a DNA sample, he refused, and this was a red flag. But I want to point out, it's not that uncommon, especially in Texas. There are actually a lot of people concerned about safety and privacy rights. And since DNA collection was still new, People didn't really like the idea of the government having all of their information on hand. Detective Elliott was understandably frustrated by this. This was the last person who had seen Jamie alive. He was about to become their #1 suspect. Refusing to cooperate with this case is definitely not something you should do, so Detective Elliott decided to follow Adam after that interview. He tailed him in a police car, but at enough distance that Adam would have had no idea. Adam ended up at a local bar called the Fox and Hound, where he drank a couple of beers. Elliott sat in the very back corner of the restaurant, trying to stay undercover. I'm imagining him with a detective hat and a trench coat, with lapels pulled up like Sherlock Holmes, but I'm sure he was just in basic clothing and waiting until Adam left because he was after one thing. As soon as Adam walked out the door, Elliott swooped in and stole the beer mugs that Adam drank out of so that he could get a couple of samples of this guy's saliva. And I'm sure some of you may be thinking that cannot be legal. But guess what? American courts have almost unanimously treated DNA left behind on things like coffee cups and dinner plates as fair game for police without a warrant, even if you're eating at a privately owned restaurant. They have to do what they have to do, and Elliott felt like he was onto something here. He immediately put the mugs in for processing and then focused on getting Jamie's boyfriend Chuck's DNA. Chuck seemed to be in a very depressed state of mind. Jamie's funeral services had been held on May 11th at Cedar Bayou Baptist Church, and she was buried at Sterling White Chapel and Cemetery. Her pallbearers included Chuck, along with several of her ex-boyfriends who had remained friends with her. That's a testament to how much people loved Jamie. However, Detective Elliott knew that even if Jamie was universally loved and had no known enemies, there was still a chance one of her exes or her current boyfriend could have had a motive. He had seen so many cases where the fiancé, husband, or boyfriend ended up being responsible, and he had a bad feeling about Chuck. Maybe it was the long hair, the kind of loner gamer persona, or the fact that most women are killed by someone they know. Whatever the reason, they sat down at the station and Detective Elliott asked routine questions to Chuck. He wanted to know where Chuck was on the night of April 30th and into the early morning hours of May 1st. Chuck replied that he was at his house playing computer games in his room alone. He was introverted, and that was his normal nighttime routine. When Detective Elliott asked if anyone had seen him, Chuck said no. He did have 2 roommates, but they were both asleep by 3 a.m. Here's Chuck with practically no alibi, no proof that he hadn't somehow intercepted Jamie after she left another guy's house. Since Chuck didn't have an alibi, Elliott asked for a DNA and fingerprint sample. Chuck got pretty nervous but ultimately complied. Then they told him to take a polygraph test. And this is where things went a little haywire, literally on the test, because Chuck failed every single question. We don't know what Detective Elliott asked him, but we can assume they included questions like, do you feel responsible for Jamie's death? Do you know who killed Jamie? Did you have anything to do with this? However, most of us know that polygraph test results are not admissible in court because they are not an exact science. They're not reliable. They're merely a tool to elicit more information from a suspect. A polygraph can yield mistaken results due to something like nerves, and we know Chuck was very incredibly nervous. But this was weird. Why was he nervous? Was he hiding something? Elliott didn't know, but he labeled Chuck a person of interest. Chuck expressed a desire to take a second polygraph to clear his name, so they administered another one, and guess what? He failed that one too. Not only that, while being interviewed, he stopped at one point, sobbing, and admitted to the detectives that he had done something terrible. He asked them to pray with him. He never told them what he meant by that, but they assumed it was some kind of confession, so they kept him on their radar, just waiting for him to crack. They also confiscated his computer and tried to look through thousands of gaming records, but from what they could gather, it could not be confirmed that he was playing on his computer that night. Elliott thought it was odd that Chuck admitted he hadn't talked to Jamie in 2 days, leading up to her murder. They searched his home and car, but nothing came back related to the case. Then, Detective Elliot asked Jamie's friends about her relationship with Chuck, and that's when he learned it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I mean, is it ever, with any relationship? Friends said Jamie and Chuck had a fight 2 days before Jamie was murdered. Jamie's friend said she was unhappy with Chuck that week and confided that she wasn't sure things were going to work out long term. That was definitely interesting news to Detective Elliot. He wondered if Jamie had ever told Chuck she wanted to break up. Had he been lying? Did they get in a big fight and it escalated? Why hadn't he come forward with this information? This new information led to an additional interview with Chuck. Again, he insisted they were looking at the wrong guy, but he was acting all twitchy and nervous, avoiding eye contact. Detective Elliot was convinced there was something more to his story. He asked about the fight, and Chuck said it wasn't really that bad of a fight. They just argued after they went to the grocery store. But they had had an argument, so Detective Elliot kept pressing and pressing, really treating Chuck like a suspect. Chuck admitted again he had done some things. Remember, he asked the detectives to pray with him last time, so Detective Elliot wondered what bad things. He looked him dead in the eyes and asked, "Was one of those bad things murdering Jamie?" Chuck answered firmly, "No." After this, Chuck left town for Dallas to be with his parents, and at that point, he retained a criminal defense attorney. Some will say that this is a form of guilt, but I would encourage anyone who is this close to a crime, whether or not they had anything to do with it, to retain counsel. It cannot be considered evidence of guilt in legal matters just because you are protecting yourself. Detective Elliot was convinced that Chuck was their guy. If the two were having issues in their relationship, and Chuck was scared about losing Jamie, he had a strong motive. It's kind of like, if I can't have her, then nobody can. Detective Elliot thought that it was possible Chuck had gotten possessive and violent, so the sheriff's department was going to stop at nothing to bring Jamie's killer to justice. They took his laptop, searched Chuck's car, and continued to bring him in for interviews, waiting patiently for all the DNA results to come back. It turns out there were no matches for the male DNA found on Jamie's body. Not one criminal in their database was a match, not the people she delivered pizzas to, not her friends or her coworker or Adam, and not Chuck. No match. So at this point, you would think that Chuck was ruled out. Well, Detective Elliot said everyone was ruled out except for Chuck, even though his DNA didn't match. That was because he was acting so suspiciously. He had a motive, in Detective Elliot's point of view, no alibi, and he failed 2 polygraph tests. Plus, he said there was just something about the way he looked. His long hair, his stoic expression, he just looked like trouble. But that wasn't enough evidence to arrest him, and this was frustrating for both parties, especially when Chuck decided to hire a defense attorney. Elliot wondered, why would he hire an attorney if he had nothing to hide? Of course, Chuck was frustrated because he insisted he was not the killer, and the real killer was running free. He thought that Detective Elliot was wasting time because of his biases, and Chuck said that he was convinced Jamie's killer was going to strike again. The sheriff's department processed all of the tips that came in and had a few promising leads. The Chicago police phoned in and said they had arrested someone who claimed he knew something about a Texas murder. But unfortunately, after a lot of questioning, it turned out to be another Texas murder. However, there was one witness who called and said that they had seen someone leave Jamie's Chevy on Welsh Avenue. They gave a rough description of this guy from what they could recall, but this description didn't match any of the potential suspects that Detective Elliot had interviewed. The witness said that the man was a black male around 5 feet 1 inch, probably in his early 20s, medium build with a bushy goatee and no mustache. He'd been wearing a white t-shirt with short sleeves, white K-Swiss tennis shoes, baggy blue shorts, and a baseball cap. While the sheriff's department had a forensic artist draw a rough sketch of what this man might look like, these sketches are never good. I don't know what it is. Now they're better with the technology, but for anyone watching, I'm going to show you the picture right now. And now I'm going to show you the sketch next to a picture of Chuck. While some of those descriptions don't match up, I'm not surprised why police continued to think that Chuck was a suspect. Chuck had a goatee at the time. He was 24, with a medium build. He wasn't black, but there was just something eerie about the eyes. Or maybe the drawing is just a little eerie itself. The stare just gets to me. Something about the drawing doesn't look human. But did it really look like Chuck? I don't know. Maybe he could have appeared to have darker skin at night. Who knows? Now, it had been a few months since Jamie's murder by the time the sheriff's department had the sketch and put it out in the local newspaper, including the Bryan College Station Eagle, which serviced the entire county. They were hoping that someone, a friend or family member, would recognize the person in this photo. The newspaper covered a few other unsolved murders from the early 90s, and people started to wonder if Jamie's murder could be connected to those. But there wasn't enough evidence to go on, and none of the murders seemed similar enough to indicate something like a serial killer. None of the articles led to promising tips. It was mid-August, without much to go on, and months after Jamie's murder. Detective Elliott figured more eyes on the case wouldn't hurt, so they referred Jamie's case to the Texas Major Crimes Assessment Committee, the Texas Rangers, and the Texas Department of Public Safety. They were all analyzing the data. Then, Jamie's friends got together and offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who had more information that would lead to solving this crime. But 6 months after Jamie's murder, not one arrest had been made, and rumors were swirling around College Station in the town of Bryan that Chuck was the one that had done it. Detective Elliott wanted to get Chuck in front of a grand jury since he was acting more and more anxious over time. Had his DNA results been a fluke? Of course, we know that DNA testing is incredibly accurate, so that was unlikely. Elliott tested over 80 people, hoping for a match, with 0 results. Over time, it seemed like the perpetrator hadn't even been part of the Texas A&M community. After all, Jamie had been found on the side of the road. Maybe the murderer had just been passing through town, like the residents had hoped. This was wishful thinking. It's always scary for a community when things like this happen, especially in Aggieland, a university town where everyone had school spirit in common. But I'm going to remind you again that Texas A&M is in College Station, while the city of Bryan is so close to College Station that a lot of students choose to live there as well. Since all of this is in the same county, cases found in rural areas, right between the two cities, just like Jamie's case, are covered by the sheriff's department. However, the Bryan PD and the College Station PD are still 2 separate entities. Sometimes these 3 departments talk to each other, but sometimes they don't, because there are so many calls made for petty crimes. Alcohol calls are typical. Disorderly conduct, being under the influence, DUIs, it's a college town. That means that each department is pretty busy, and having a community of terrified people means you're going to be working overtime. Jamie's friends were still grieving and hoping that someone would be caught. Her roommate Jake said that learning about Jamie's death was like sitting on a grenade. It was just so unexpected and brought so much pain and destruction all at once. And it wasn't over yet. Just a year later, in May of 2000, Jim, Donna, and all of Jamie's sisters still thought about her every day. Just a month earlier in April, they celebrated her life at Texas A&M's annual muster ceremony. It's one of those traditions I talked about, Jamie wanting to be a part of it when she decided to go to Texas A&M. But you could have never imagined that you would be part of it in this way. Every month at A&M, there's a silent ceremony called Silver Taps, where they honor students who have passed away. Every year there's a huge vigil held for alumni and students, and that's the one I'm referring to that happened in April of 2000, called Muster. All over the world, groups of Texas A&M alumni read out a list of names of students and alumni who passed away, and everyone stands in solidarity and remembrance. Jamie's family gathered on Kyle Field, and the speaker performed a roll call for the absent. They lit a candle for her, and when her name was called, they said, "We are here." Jamie would have loved it. She wanted more than anything to be part of Aggie alumni and to be part of something greater than herself. It was graduation season at the time, and over a year had passed without the case advancing. Police were concerned that Jamie's case had gone cold and they might never find the perpetrator. Even worse, another College Station woman might fall into harm's way if this person decided to strike again. Like Chuck had stressed to detectives, he thought he would. Detective Kenny Elliott was still trying to get Chuck in front of that grand jury, but there still was no evidence to prove that Chuck was connected to the crime. The search of his car didn't lead anywhere, and he actually had been logged onto his laptop in the early morning hours when Jamie was killed. However, there was nothing confirming or denying he was asleep at 4:30 in the morning. A year after Jamie's murder, on May 28th of the year 2000, 20-year-old Texas A&M student Kristen Lancaster was invited to hang out at a friend's apartment in the DeVore apartment complex in College Station. DeVore, the Westside Drive apartments, and Jamie's townhouse on Charlotte Court were all about a 10-minute drive from one another. Kristen didn't know Jamie, but coincidentally, her brother used to work with Jamie before she was murdered. She will never forget when Jamie passed away. Kristen's brother came home from work incredibly upset and scared. The two of them spent the next few months looking over their shoulders, double-checking their doors and surroundings. They couldn't believe a tragedy like this had hit so close to home. They were shocked it would happen in College Station, where they always felt safe. By the time a year had passed, the fear had died down, but all of it was going to come bubbling up again when Kristen pulled up to the DeVore apartments. It was like she was living the nightmare all over again. There were police cars everywhere, crime scene tape, ambulances, and people dusting for fingerprints. It was like something you would see on a crime show, and never something you expect to see in real life. Earlier that morning at 4:50 a.m., someone at the DeVore apartments called 911 to report smoke coming from one of the units. Firemen Robert Mumford and Leon Moore responded to the call with their fire truck. They figured it was their usual call. Some rowdy college students had lit a dumpster on fire or something like that. This was a very lively area with lots of big college parties on a regular basis. When they arrived, they saw smoke filtering out of a partially open window right next to the front door of an upper-story apartment. Firefighter Mumford went up the stairs and assessed the scene. He was trying to look through that window, but the smoke was heavy and it was dark inside. The window screen had been folded outward. It actually appeared that it had been slashed open, like there had been some kind of break-in. He called down for firefighter Leon Moore and Police Lieutenant Bobby Rogers to join him. When they opened up the door to apartment 52, it was pitch black inside, and the fire looked like it was coming from a bedroom. Lieutenant Rogers pulled out his flashlight, trying to see through the haze of smoke. There was an awful smell coming from the room. This wasn't just a smell of fire, it was a distinctive smell. If you've ever smelled it once, you'll never forget it. It's the smell of death, it's the smell of burning flesh. Once they got inside that bedroom, it was clear there was a fire burning on the carpet, and once they extinguished the flames, they could finally see where the smell was coming from. It was a horrific sight. There was a young woman lying on the floor at the edge of the bed, nude from her waist down and partially propped up. It was obvious that she was no longer alive. Her body had been engulfed in flames. The officers immediately backed out of the room to preserve evidence, and of course, they suspected foul play. Lieutenant Rogers went downstairs to his vehicle to call for backup, and when the College Station police arrived, it was a little after 5. AIM Officer Anthony Conkle walked in and did the initial assessment of what had happened. The young woman was in a sitting position. Her torso was leaned up against the bed, and her legs were lying on the floor, spread apart. It seemed very unlikely that she died in that exact position. Rigor mortis had already set in, and it looked as though someone had moved her there and then propped her up. Her clothes had been removed, except for a t-shirt and socks. The perpetrator had taken a bunch of random items from around the house, all things that they thought might actually be flammable. Things like paper, makeup brushes, pens, and pencils had been put into a metal pen and pencil container, which was set between the victim's legs. This appeared to be used to start the fire. The area between her upper thighs and legs was completely burned. Officer Conkle felt disturbed. He had all kinds of thoughts racing through his head. The culprit had made no move to burn any part of her body other than the area between her legs, so he thought that this must have been sexual in nature, or at least an attempt of some kind. Why else would anyone burn this specific part of someone's body? It was morbid and sickening. Officer Conkle of the College Station Police Department, as well as Officer Jeff Capps, who was assigned to the case, began their investigation of this bedroom. In the bed, they found a pair of blue underwear. It was aggressively torn at the seams, and the waistband was completely missing. They didn't know where it was. Also, this is sad, but they could visibly see that the underwear was covered in fecal material, and they wondered if it had been removed while this person was alive, or if the assailant ripped it off post-mortem to try to hide evidence. Investigators looked at the cuts on that window screen I talked about next to the front door. They figured the perpetrator had cut the screen from the outside, reached through the open window, unlocked the door, and got in. But was it a break-in, or was this a ruse? Had the woman known her attacker and let them into the apartment? This definitely seemed like it was her apartment based on things like her makeup collection and her jewelry. But they looked in the bathroom, and the toilet seat was raised. However, looking around again, towels that looked like they belonged to a female were all the same pattern and thrown across the floor. They were cleaner. The fire alarm had been completely torn off the wall and thrown in the sink. They wondered how long ago this fire had been set. It was really hard to tell. As for the towels, it seemed like this woman's attacker had tried to clean up some fingerprints, because when they checked for fingerprints, they realized this person had been very thorough and had not left much evidence behind. In the kitchen, the contents of the woman's purse had been dumped out, including a wallet and checkbook. They were able to identify her from looking in her wallet. Her driver's license was inside. Her name was Carolyn Diane Casey. She had been murdered and possibly violated in her own apartment. Police determined her car keys and her house keys were missing, but other valuable things in her house had not been stolen and her car was still in the lot. It did not seem like a robbery. It was much more calculated. From what Officer Conkle and Capps could gather, someone had broken into Carolyn's apartment, brutalized her, and tried to erase the evidence by setting the apartment on fire. Also, there were knives missing from a knife block in her kitchen, and when the police searched, they found a knife under Carolyn's bed, which seemed like an odd place for a knife to be. They wondered if this had been used to tear off her underwear or cause any injuries, or if it was the one used to cut the screen. If it was used to cut the screen and it had come from her own kitchen, that's why I said it might be a ruse, because they were thinking this could have been staged to look like a burglary. So they collected all the evidence and continued to search the apartment for DNA. They took Carolyn's body and transported it to the Brazos County Medical Examiner's office for a full autopsy and an official confirmation of her identity. So, I want to tell you about Carolyn Diane Casey. She was an all-American girl born on June 28, 1978. She was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, and her parents, Anita Kennedy Casey and Larry Casey, lived there for the first 8 years of her life. She was the tiniest little baby, and she was so loved by her family. Anita and Larry were hard-working, church-going people, and they loved children. They welcomed their second child, Amanda, into the world a few years after Carolyn, and Carolyn doted on her little sister. They were in each other's corners through thick and thin. Carolyn was 8 when the family moved to Aberry, which is a tiny little town in upstate Texas with a really good school district. She grew up with a few close friends and small classes and went to First Baptist Church with her family every Sunday. When Carolyn was in middle school, the family moved again, and this time they settled in none other than College Station. She wasn't the biggest fan of huge public schools, so she enrolled at Timber Academy for her high school years. Timber is a non-traditional high school where students work at their own pace, and they could personalize their educational experience. It was different from a disciplinary program or a GED program. This was about tailoring each teaching to each student and required rigorous applications to get in. Carolyn excelled in all of her classes, and after she graduated, she began working at the preschool childcare center at First Baptist Church in College Station in 1996. She taught classes to preschool-age kids while their parents were at work, and she loved children. It was a great way for her to stay connected with her family and her faith as well. Everyone could tell that Carolyn was wonderful with kids, and she wanted to be a mom someday. They knew she would be great at it. She was such a giver, and just like Jamie, she didn't have any enemies. She trusted that, deep down, humans were good. 3 weeks before she was found burning on the floor of her apartment, 21-year-old Carolyn had just been hired as a part-time floor manager at Big Lots, which is a discount retailer also in the College Station area, only about 15 minutes from her home. Outside of work, Carolyn had a wide network of friends who loved her, and she was still very close to her parents and her sister Amanda. She was known for her bubbly personality, her laughter, her golden blonde hair, and her pretty blue eyes. Carolyn didn't usually go out to parties and bars. She preferred to stay home, go to work, and keep to herself. But when she did go out, she liked to let loose, and she enjoyed socializing with friends. Now she was dead, and everyone was left wondering how this could happen. Early in the morning on May 28th, after Carolyn's body had been found, her family was notified. Larry, Anita, and Amanda were waking up early, enjoying their Sunday before going to church. That's when they received the call, a call they will never forget. On the other end, Larry heard the words, "Is your daughter Carolyn Casey?" When he replied yes, Officer Jeff Kapp said, "There has been an accident and your daughter's dead, a fire, and it's being investigated as a homicide." Immediately, Larry was in complete denial. His oldest daughter, the most responsible and hardworking, killed in a fire at only 21 years old. When Amanda heard the news, she screamed so loud her ears started to ring, and she collapsed. She couldn't believe her sister was actually gone. Anita couldn't stop thinking about those words, "Your daughter is dead." They hoped there was some kind of mistake. It wasn't until Amanda called Carolyn's apartment and the phone just kept ringing and ringing that everything became real. They would never hear Carolyn's voice ever again. Carolyn's parents couldn't believe it. Her mother had to be physically picked up off the floor. They all got into the car to head to the morgue to identify her body, and as they drove, they were silent the entire way. Larry had just spoken to his daughter hours before this. He asked her if she wanted to come home that Memorial Day weekend, but she said she was busy with friends, ending the call with, "I love you," and he said it back to her before hanging up the call with his daughter for the very last time. The police went door to door at Dewan Apartments. It was quite a big complex, with several different buildings and a number of units. They wanted to find out if anyone knew Carolyn and if they had seen or heard from her the night before. Now, Yasha Harburg was a neighbor who lived in Carolyn's building, and he told police that he had heard loud noises at Carolyn's between 1:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock in the morning. During that 30-minute period, he heard a thudding sound over and over again, but it seemed to end as soon as it began, so Yasha went back to sleep. This narrowed down the time frame that Carolyn could have been killed, but it was hard to know if the thudding was the sound of a struggle or if that was around the time a man had pulled the fire alarm out of the wall. In less than an hour of going door to door, Detective Kapp also learned that there had been a big house party the night before, only 2 buildings away in the same complex. The host was a guy named Chris Hiles. Detective Kapp went to Chris's door and interviewed him right there. He said he was a friend of Carolyn's and that she was at his party. Chris explained that on Saturday, May 27th, he invited her to his house to party with him, his roommates, and a bunch of other friends, students and residents of the community. He lived only 2 buildings down from hers at the Dewan apartment complex, so she didn't have to worry about getting a ride home. She could just walk. That night, she planned to have a couple of shots and celebrate her new job. Carolyn walked over to Chris's, but before she knew it, it had been a few hours, and she had had a few too many drinks. Carolyn told Chris she actually felt sick to her stomach at one point, so she was going to go home. He said he saw her leave alone a little bit after midnight. It was the start of summer in Texas. The weather was nice, not too hot, and it would have been a nice night to take a short walk across the complex. It would not have taken her long. Chris was actually pretty helpful. He provided a complete list of all the names of everyone who had attended the party, and he gave it to detectives. They set out to interview each one. In the meanwhile, they told Chris if he remembered anything to let them know. I want to pause to tell you what Carolyn's autopsy results showed. Dr. Jane Garavaglia was the examiner who carried out Carolyn's autopsy, and within just a few days, her cause of death was officially ruled strangulation and the manner of death a homicide. They looked for evidence of sexual assault, but all the tests were negative. She had been so badly burned between her thighs that it was actually impossible to tell if she had been violated. If any DNA evidence had been in that area at the time of her death, it was destroyed. But that didn't matter. They were quite certain they were looking for a male perpetrator. It was clear that something had happened that caused the assailant to burn her in this way. Dr. Garavaglia also said that, quote, "It is very common for people to defecate in their undergarments when they are very scared or at the time of death," end quote. Carolyn had been strangled, which is one of the scariest ways that someone can die. It's very personal and it can take a while. She was likely brought in and out of consciousness. Based on the nature of her wounds, it was impossible to tell at what point she had gone to the bathroom and why. If she was scared, if she had already passed, or if she was sick to her stomach, as she had mentioned to Chris, and had been attacked before she had a chance to make it to the bathroom in her apartment. The medical examiner was able to find DNA evidence on Carolyn's body. As it turned out, Carolyn had fought back, and she scratched the person who attacked her. She had gotten some of their skin and some fibers under her fingernails. These same fibers were also found in her bedroom and on her clothing. Now all detectives had to do was find clothing that matched those fibers and someone's DNA that matched the skin. When police further investigated inside Carolyn's bedroom, they finally found the band from her underwear. It was actually tucked into her bedding. The doctor also determined that Carolyn was already deceased when the fire was started. There was no slit found in her lungs. Some may say that's one good thing, but none of this is good. There was a monster walking among them. 2 days after Carolyn was found, investigators searched the exterior of the Duchin apartment complex to see if they could find any items that might point them in the right direction. In one of the dumpsters, they found towels that matched the exact towels that were in Carolyn's bathroom, and they found her car keys and her house keys thrown away. It's interesting because why would someone take her keys in the first place? In the meantime, remember that 20-year-old Texas A&M student I told you about, Kristen Lancaster, whose brother used to work with our first victim, Jamie, whose case, by the way, was still open and unsolved at the time this was happening? Well, after Kristen saw the commotion at her friend's apartment complex, she went home to find out what was going on. Over the next few days, she began reading the reports on Carolyn's death in local newspapers. None of the details were released about how she had been killed, but it reminded Kristen so much of Jamie's case. They had the same color hair, the same complexion, and the Hard family, 13 months after Jamie's death, was still in the dark about how Jamie was killed and why. Opening the newspaper and seeing another girl murdered was frightening. They had a bad feeling that these murders were connected, but how? Kristen thought she might know something. No, she wasn't trying to be an armchair detective. Not that there's anything wrong with that, or a web sleuth like we have today. But Kristen was suffering from PTSD from a horrific experience she had back in October of 1999, just 6 months after Jamie was killed. Seeing all this in the news, and when she pulled up to her friend's apartment, she was taken right back into that scary headspace when she was once fighting for her own life. Kristen Danette Lancaster was born on October 30th, 1980, in Bryan, Texas, where she grew up. In 1999, she was an 18-year-old still living in the area. She went to school at Texas A&M and worked part-time as a server. By her birthday month in October 1999, the years surrounding Jamie's murder had died down, and many people had moved forward. 18-year-old Kristen felt the same way. She wanted to enjoy the beginning of her college experience. On October 23rd, Kristen's friend invited her to a house party at a Bryan apartment complex on Wayside Drive. It was at the Sandalwood Gardens Apartments at 505 Wayside Drive in Bryan, Texas. It was the weekend, and Kristen seriously needed a break after midterms. When Kristen finally showed up at the house party, music was playing, and people were already a few drinks deep. Kristen's friend, the owner of the apartment, let's call her Jess, was busy chatting with her boyfriend, so Kristen struck up a conversation with a guy that she didn't know, but who was hanging out with everyone. They were both drinking, so they were just kind of exchanging small talk. The guy seemed outgoing and well-spoken as he was mumbling to her about the things that were going on in his life. Kristen heard him mention he was 24, that he had been married once before, and that he was young at the time and had made some mistakes. He mentioned things like not being a good partner to his wife, but now he had found God and was living his best life. Kristen felt refreshed by how open he was. Not everyone can have these deep conversations so quickly, unless, of course, they're under the influence. I'm sure most of us have either seen these kinds of people in person or on TV or in movies, kind of pointless exchanges that in the moment, the person just wants to feel accepted and heard, kind of a confession of regrets and hoping to get some words of compassion or understanding. Especially considering Kristen was an attractive female, it seemed like this guy was being a little flirtatious, but all very polite. Then, all of a sudden, Kristen's friend, who had invited her to the party, Jess, got into an argument with her boyfriend, and things escalated into a yelling match. It didn't help that they were both under the influence. The party ended immediately. No one wanted to get in the middle of what was happening, so they all called rides to get them home. But Kristen was concerned for her friend. She wanted to be there just in case something escalated and the police needed to be called. So she stuck around and sat outside on Jess's porch with the guy that she had met that night. They kept Jess's apartment door open just a little bit so they could hear what was going on in case anything happened. Meanwhile, Kristen and the guy from the party continued to make small talk. She was more interested in hearing what was happening with Jess, so she was kind of only half paying attention. After a while, when nothing really escalated, Kristen said she didn't want to just sit there and eavesdrop on Jess and her boyfriend's whole argument, but she didn't want to leave either. Well, Mr. Friendly was like, "You know what? It's getting a little chilly. My place is right upstairs. Why don't you come up there? We can hang out, we can talk until their arguing is done, or if the argument gets worse, we can race back downstairs or call the cops." This sounded like a good solution. Kristen didn't want to intrude on Jess's situation, but she felt safe since she wouldn't be that far from her friend's place, and the guy had routinely been making her feel more and more comfortable throughout the night. So they walked up the steps. He opened the door, and then, like a switch was flicked, he pushed Kristen inside. This happened so fast. The guy just turned and slammed the door shut and locked it. Then he grabbed a remote control close to the door that was on a side table, turned on the stereo, and turned up the music to a completely deafening volume. Then he turned to Kristen and aggressively told her to take off her clothes. Of course, Kristen was shocked. She could barely hear herself think, much less hear him over the music. So she thought he had to be joking. And if so, it wasn't funny. She tried to get to the door, but he pushed her away and continued to demand that she get undressed. That's when she realized that something horrific was about to happen to her. She kept refusing, and as she did, the man got closer and closer. Then, when he was close enough, he reached out and wrapped his hand around her throat and squeezed firmly until Kristen couldn't breathe. She was afraid for her life. She thought this was the end and that he was never going to let her go. But all of a sudden, he loosened his grip, and when he did, she screamed as loud as she possibly could. But he quickly reached out and started choking her again. He was so strong, and she was so much smaller than him, that he actually lifted her up by the throat and took her into the back bedroom, and she blacked out. This must have been absolutely terrifying. Now I am about to go into the details about what happened to Kristen, but because I know that some of you may have been victims of the same type of crime, and it can be triggering, if you do not want to hear this, you can skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen. And I'll be as quick as I can. Kristen was incredibly smart and quick on her feet, and her actions saved her. She took every opportunity she could to stall her perpetrator. First, of course, she argued with him, saying that she did not want to take her clothes off. She said, "I'm not going to do it." But he looked at her with these evil eyes and said, "You're going to do it." She knew she had to comply, but when she did, she took off her clothes as slowly as she could. Then, when he was trying to get on top of her, she looked at him and said, "You don't want to do this." He stopped for a minute and was like, "Why don't I want to do this?" That's when Kristen came up with a lie. She told him that she had HIV, hoping that he would decide this was not worth it. He stopped, and she saw him thinking about it for a second, but it didn't work. He looked at her and said, "Well, guess what? I have it too." And then he lunged forward and got on top of her. Kristen then tried to talk to him about God. She asked him, "Is this what you were talking about when you said that you had found God and you were working on yourself?" This actually did make him stop, and he got off of her, at which point she was able to get off the bed and started to stomp loudly on the floor. She was strategically making it look like she was stomping to make a point, like why would you do such a thing? Just stomping the ground, for emphasis. Really, she was trying to alert her friend Jess downstairs, but this set the guy off again, and he began to reach out and touch her sexually. She described the feeling of his hands around her neck again, so tight that she thought the bones in her neck were going to break. When she told him that he might kill her, he said, "Do you think I actually care about that?" So, he did have the intention to end her life. He didn't care about her at all. He just wanted what he wanted. By the way, he calculated his movements, bringing her in and out of consciousness. To her, it seemed like he had done this before. When Kristen blacked out and came to again, he was just starting to unbuckle his belt. She assumed he would hit her with it, but then he got up, told her to be quiet, and ran from the room. At this point, she screamed, "Call the police! Call the police!" over and over again. But to her surprise, the police were already there. It was like a scene in a movie where the main character is too close to an exploding bomb, and their hearing goes out. Everything was fuzzy. Kristen was trying to figure out what was happening. She could hear the voices of the man who had tricked her and several police officers, who she would later learn were members of the Bryan PD. It turned out her friend Jess had called 911, reporting that she heard a woman screaming in the apartment above her. When police arrived and knocked on the upstairs apartment door, they heard loud music, a scuffle inside, and then a woman yelling to call the police. They heard a stomping sound, and when the door was opened, the man behind it was agitated and aggressive to the point of violence. They immediately handcuffed him in the main room, and in the bedroom, they found a partially clothed young woman on the floor, shaking uncontrollably in the fetal position. The police took the man to the Bryan police station for questioning and talked to Jess, who realized that the woman screaming upstairs was her friend Kristen. I'm not sure if Kristen was taken to the hospital then, but I do know that she spent the rest of the night sleeping on Jess's couch and trying to comprehend the traumatic event that had just happened to her. Now you know why Kristen had PTSD, and also why she felt there was a connection between what happened to her and these two women being killed. You may wonder who this man is and what transpired after this attack on Kristen. I will let you know everything, but I want to go back to Carolyn's investigation so I can connect the dots going forward as they began connecting the dots going backward. Remember Carolyn's friend Chris, the one who threw the party she was at? He did reach back out to investigators saying that he had remembered something from that night that stood out to him. He had noticed his upstairs neighbor had left the party before Carolyn. This wouldn't be that unusual, except for the fact that the neighbor came back around 1 a.m. When his neighbor walked in, Chris noticed he smelled terrible. Chris couldn't pinpoint what the smell was, but he said it definitely wasn't BO, it was something else, something rancid. Detective Capps went upstairs to Chris's neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door. Inside, there were two guys, Mike R. and Unobi Matthews. They seemed like ordinary guys, but the terrible smell Chris reported was the best lead that Detective Capps had, so he brought them both to the station to be interviewed. They willingly came and even brought along the clothing they said they wore on the night of the 28th. They each talked to Officer Paul Price. Mike consented to all forms of DNA collection, including blood samples, saliva, head hair, and pubic hair. He gave over his clothes and explained that he had been at the house party the entire time and had gone back upstairs to his own apartment to get into bed before the party ended. Mike said that Carolyn was like his sister. They grew up together in the same town. They saw each other at parties, around the complex, and would even confide in one another about personal stuff. When officers asked if Carolyn had ever expressed romantic interest in Mike, Chris, or Unob, or if any of them had expressed interest in her, Mike said no. He was trying to look for a motive. Just like Mike, Unobi also consented to all forms of DNA collection, including blood samples, saliva, head hair, and pubic hair. He gave the police a pair of dark blue shorts and a white t-shirt that had the words "Rehab is for quitters" on it. He explained he'd also gone to the house party with Mike. He knew Carolyn from living in the complex. They played basketball together from time to time, and he had seen her at the party that night. He said he recalled talking to her for a little bit, but not that long. Around midnight, he went to a nearby gas station with another woman. He bought a pack of cigarettes there, and then his brother wasn't feeling well, so he went to check on him and then returned to the party, staying until it ended. His brother did confirm that he had been there that night to see if he was okay. Both of these men's stories seemed legit. There was nothing that stood out to investigators, so they were both free to go and get back to their lives. Forensic analysts looked at Mike's and Unobi's clothing under a microscope, and none of the fibers matched up with the fibers on Carolyn's clothing. So what was Chris talking about when he mentioned that bad smell? Was Chris lying? Was he placing the blame onto Mike and Unobi, almost to cover his own tracks? Maybe everyone police interviewed said Carolyn left the party after midnight. She'd been sick, and many of them happily provided DNA evidence. Detective Capps decided to order background checks, and those take 1 or 2 days to process. He decided to go on what he could. If Unobi and a mysterious other woman had gone to a convenience store during the party, he wanted to check it out. Detective Capps went over to the store and requested surveillance footage from between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., and sure enough, there was Unobi and the woman in the video with him. But when he watched the video, Unobi was wearing different clothing. It wasn't the white shirt and blue shorts like he said. Now he was wondering, did he lie? If he lied about the clothes, was he lying about other things? So they went to his apartment once again and requested the actual clothing he had worn that night. Unobi just apologized, saying he had completely forgotten what he had worn. From the video, it seemed to be a black jersey-type shirt with black shorts or pants and a white pair of sneakers. He told the detectives they were welcome to search his entire apartment for the clothing that they thought he was wearing. As they looked, they found a pile of dirty clothes on the floor in his closet, which included the ones that appeared to be in that video. All the while, Unobi was calm. He was just sitting there playing PlayStation and hardly paying attention to the officers. He really didn't seem to care that there was a murder investigation going on. So Detective Capps wondered how drunk he really was at that party, if he could forget what he had been wearing. It sounded suspicious, but they tested Unobi's clothing and lo and behold, there was zero forensic evidence. No clothing fibers, no DNA, nothing. Detective Capps was again at a dead end, but you know those background checks he ordered? They came in that late afternoon, 2.5 days after Carolyn had been killed. He browsed through them at his desk. All the people at the party were your average citizens. No crimes, no outstanding warrants, except there was an outstanding warrant about a month ago. On May 5th, there had been a misdemeanor trial for a man accused of sexual assault. He was initially charged with unlawful restraint, but had completely skipped out on that hearing. The Bryan police had gone to his previous address at Wayside Drive, except the guy didn't live there anymore. He had moved halfway through the year and hadn't updated his address with the court. His name was Enobi Matthews. This wasn't enough evidence to connect him to someone's murder, but Officer Capps quickly realized this man had attacked a female before. He wanted to get every detail on this other case. When he looked further into the documents, he realized Enobi had attempted to strangle the woman who accused him of attacking her, and that she reported feeling like she was going to die. That woman was none other than Kristen Lancaster. Yep, the dots are connecting. Was Enobi the same guy that killed Carolyn and maybe even Jamie? If so, why was he on the street? How did he get away with the attack on Kristen? Anyway, well, back when it happened, which you will recall was 6 months following Jamie's murder, Enobi was brought in for questioning, and he told a completely different story than what Kristen had told Jess and the police. First, he said nothing happened between them. Nothing. That's a little weird because police said they heard Kristen scream for the cops. So why would she do that? Well, according to Enobi, something did happen. There had been an encounter in which Kristen had told him to stop, but it wasn't a sexual attack. No, it was nothing that extreme. According to him, he said he invited her over during that party, promising to sell her cocaine. However, Kristen didn't have the money, so she agreed to give him a striptease in exchange for the drugs. Well, he didn't mind the striptease, but he told the cops that he gave her crushed-up aspirin instead of cocaine. When she figured it out, she got upset. She screamed, and she was punching him, and they got into a fight because he was shoving her off of him to calm her down. Now, she was trying to claim that he sexually violated her, but he hadn't even touched her. Just in self-defense, he told the cops she was lying. This story does sound far-fetched to me, but now it's 2024 and this was 1999. I don't know if things have definitely changed, and I've always advocated for believing in women in these cases. I have realized how much evil men have gotten away with, but it doesn't mean that women are always telling the truth either. At that point, Kristen had not given her testimony to the police. This was the first story that they were hearing. All of the details lined up. Was it a drug deal gone wrong, or was it something else? Whatever happened, investigators knew that Kristen hadn't been able to leave. Otherwise, she would have been screaming for someone to call the police. Without any hard evidence, they charged Enobi with unlawful restraint, a Class A misdemeanor. It's a serious crime that would require a hearing, but they didn't have enough to actually put him in jail for inflicting harm, and they let him go the next morning. That morning, Jess convinced Kristen to go to the county crisis center, and she met with counselors. Kristen thought that what happened to her wouldn't qualify as anything sexual because the man that attacked her hadn't used his private part, it was just his hands. But they told her yes, what she experienced was an extreme violation of a sexual nature, and she should file a police report so the man would face consequences for his actions. Jess called the police herself. She didn't know that upstairs neighbor, and she didn't even invite him to the party. The guy just showed up, and she wanted him to pay for what he had done to Kristen. When the police told her that he hadn't been charged with a sexual crime, she was outraged. He had almost killed her friend, and he was walking free. She told all of this to Kristen, and Kristen was also very angry and confused, but mostly terrified. She knew she had to go report it herself, and that's what she did. She went with her dad to the Bryan Police Department to give her testimony. Of course, both the police and Kristen have very different stories about what happened. According to police reports, the officer asked her routine questions about what happened that night. They belied Kristen about what happened, but they needed a full testimony, which meant they had to ask her some hard questions. According to Kristen, she felt that the police blamed her. She was hysterically crying. She pointed to her throat and said, "Do you see this bruising?" Her entire throat was all different colors, and she couldn't even swallow. The officer told her to put her own hands around her own throat, and this was to prove she could have choked herself. How would anyone at that level of bruising? I mean, it's obvious, but of course all of that was left out of the police reports, and the department denied that the officer had been that insensitive. Of course, I can't find the name of the person who interviewed her, so we'll never know exactly what happened. So let's just say it was tense and upsetting for both Kristen and the interviewer. The police took photos of the bruising, and in the next 2 months, Kristen came in for multiple interviews to talk about the worst night of her life. Finally, they did charge Unimaginable with first-degree sexual assault over 2 months later. Now that Unimaginable was arrested, Kristen tried to recover from the horrific violation of her body and her mind. She quit her job, she tried focusing on herself, and she refused to attend that trial. Instead, she moved forward and just let the justice system do what it had to do. But that probably wasn't the best idea, because here's where things went wrong. When Unimaginable went to his indictment, he faced a grand jury without Kristen's testimony. Since she refused to face him in court, the jury only had the prosecutor's testimony of what Kristen had gone through and the pictures of the bruising from that evening. Unimaginable was free to tell his own story. He still called it a drug deal gone wrong, though he did admit to locking the door and physically harming her. But he claimed he'd only hurt Kristen by grabbing her neck right when the police arrived. He said it was a crime of passion, since he knew that he was the one who was going to get in trouble because she would accuse him of everything that he had done to her. I have to tell you, he's a pretty convincing liar. The jury knew that they'd both been drinking at a college house party, and the jury was in a position where there was reasonable doubt about whether Kristen's story was true. So they decided not to indict him due to lack of evidence. The charge was dropped, but he could still be put in prison for unlawful restraint, and the next trial was scheduled for May 5, 2000. But until then, Unimaginable was allowed to go back to his life. When Kristen realized that this man had walked free, she felt betrayed, and she was scared that he might track her down and kill her. She didn't cope by isolating herself in her apartment. Instead, she engaged in risky behaviors, like heavy drinking and hanging out with men she didn't know, even getting on the back of a guy's motorcycle after both of them had been drinking. And before you judge, this is very normal for someone who's experienced a traumatic event, and it's very sad that he put her in that position of needing to cope this way. But over time, Kristen did recover. She took up new hobbies like long-distance running, she went back to work, and she even started dating a new guy. Kristen was able to move forward one step at a time. Her grades went back up, she made new friends, and while it took a long time, she had the strength to talk about her near-death experience and express how lucky she felt that the police arrived on time that night. At the time, nobody thought for a moment that Kristen's case was related to Jamie's murder. When the truth inevitably came out, it would change the way people felt about their community forever. When Detective Capps was looking over all the documents regarding what happened between Unimaginable and Kristen, he realized that Kristen almost died, and it was from strangulation, and Carolyn had been strangled to death. She lived in the same complex, and he admitted to being with her that night. Detective Capps noticed that Unimaginable had skipped out on his court date in Kristen's case, so he could arrest him for that. He wanted to get this guy off the streets fast. He was bad news, whether or not he was connected with these other women. On June 2nd, Officer Capps sat down with him for another interview. This time, he had a game plan. He wanted to see if he could put some pressure on Unimaginable, to see if he would actually admit that he had something to do with Carolyn's murder. The thing is, there was no DNA connected to him found at the crime scene, but he didn't know that. So, Detective Capps told his supervisor to page him with a simple message while he was in the room interviewing Unimaginable. Just text that the DNA matches in big letters. He sat down with Unimaginable for another interview, and when he started it, he said, "Any minute now, we're going to have those DNA results about who killed Carolyn. Remember that there was DNA under her fingernails, and Unibie's DNA had been sampled several days ago. It takes weeks for DNA to be matched up in the system, but Detective Capps was banking on Unimaginable not having any idea how long it took. Also, if he was the perpetrator, He would have no idea that the police had found DNA underneath her fingernails. Remember, the person had made an effort to wipe fingerprints off of everything and then burn Carolyn's legs. He wouldn't expect there to be any evidence left over. Detective Cap was right. When the head of the College Station police paged him with the message, the DNA matches, he asked Inobi to read the words out loud, and that's when he freaked out. Inobi got emotional, broke down, and admitted right there that he had killed Carolyn, but by accident. On accident? After everything that happened with Kristen, when he looked her in the eyes and said he didn't care about whether she died, he was going to say that this was an accident? No, he killed her in cold blood. That was obvious, especially with the way her body was found, only half clothed. The DNA results weren't back yet, but a confession was enough to arrest Inobi for first-degree murder. That's when the police started putting the puzzle pieces together and trying to figure out what happened. Inobi Catron Matthews was born April 14, 1976, in College Station and jumped around Texas most of his life. He left high school during his senior year, got married, and had his first child at 17 years old. In the next 6 years, he would have 3 more children, get divorced, and work as a cook, a carpenter, a laborer, and a nighttime grocery store clerk. I couldn't figure out if the store that he worked at was Big Lots. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, though, because we know Carolyn had just started working there. Whether he targeted her there, or they just crossed paths because they lived in the same apartment complex, it didn't matter. The connection was made. Here's something interesting. In 1999, Inobi was living at Sandalwood Gardens on Wayside in Bryan with a friend. You know, the place where he attacked Kristen. But his friends and roommates said he left under mysterious circumstances and moved in with another friend, that guy Mike, at Dwan apartment complex. That was in early 2000, but Inobi wasn't on the lease, so nobody in the complex that was in charge of all the leasing papers would have had any idea he lived there or that he had a criminal record. It's so easy to just slide by like that, to just move in with a friend. And wow, did this guy have a long criminal record. In the early 90s, he faced 4 different charges of cruelty to animals. You know that killers very regularly have a history of cruelty to animals, and there are a couple of theories why. There's the graduation theory, where they start with weaker creatures as practice for targeting humans, and there's also the general deviant theory, where they will take out their anger and rejection on animals. It's a combination of both, and animal cruelty often indicates someone will engage in a pattern of violence in the future. In 1993, Inobi pleaded no contest to animal cruelty. He managed to escape prison time and was just put on probation. In 1995, he was charged with first-degree force sexual intercourse. He forced himself on a friend in her apartment while they were drinking. Sound familiar? Yeah, he's done the exact same thing before, and he faced the Dallas County grand jury and pleaded not guilty. That jury chose not to indict him. Just like in Kristen's case, there wasn't enough evidence to sentence him to prison. Another of his animal cruelty misdemeanors happened in 1997, along with a cocaine possession charge. It started off with jail time, but then decreased to 3 years of probation. Inobi's jail time officially ended in January 2000, so this man had received the unlawful restraint charge in Kristen's case while on probation. After all this, how did he get away with so much? I'm shocked that he managed to slip through the cracks so many times. He was a smooth talker, for one thing. One of those people who went out of his way to say hello to strangers and wore like eccentric outfits, funky Hawaiian shirts, trying to act like a cool guy. It was really unlikely that anyone would suspect he was a predator without seeing his records. He was kind of like a gentle giant, but really was quite a big guy who could overpower an unsuspecting woman. On June 2nd, we told Detective Capps the official story of what happened. He said that he and Carolyn had been seeing each other on and off for the last 3 weeks, and weirdly enough, this time frame matched up to when she started working at Big Lots. He said on the night of the party he was pretty drunk and he'd gone to her place around midnight. They'd been messing around, he ripped off her underwear, and then they had consensual sex. But I was thinking, why rip them if it was consensual? I don't know. Maybe some people were into that and they were two of those people. But afterward, he said they got into an argument about Inobe's younger brother because he was accusing her of flirting with him or something. Carolyn admitted, yeah, she was attracted to him and she could F him if she wanted to. So he called her the B word and she tried to hit him, and that's when he snapped. He strangled her and she just happened to die, but he didn't mean to, and he was scared. He didn't know what to do, so he left the apartment trying to figure it all out. He said eventually he returned, wiped down all of the areas his fingerprints might be on, and then he tried to destroy the evidence. He cut the window screen with one of her knives to make it look like a burglary. And we're expected to believe this version of events? Why not just call 911 if there's really an accident? Because we know he's lying. Keep in mind, Carolyn was sick when she got home. The detectives really didn't think that she would have been in the mood to have an argument with anyone, or even be around anyone. She had just left a social environment, telling her friend Chris that she really needed to go because she was ill. Chris never mentioned Inobe was with Carolyn as a boyfriend, or even seeing her acting like they were a couple, or that they were involved at all, and they didn't leave together. Also, Chris had told police that Inobe was missing from the party before Carolyn left, so he must have been waiting for her to leave and followed her to her apartment. Finally, why would there be female matter in her underwear if they had had sex before she was murdered? Carolyn was terrified. That alone proved the attack was non-consensual. After his confession, Inobe was arrested for Carolyn's murder, and his bail was set at $300,000. I want to return to Jamie's case so that I can tie things together. Remember the description of the person that someone saw drive Jamie's Chevy to Welsh Avenue? A 5 feet 11 inches black man in his early 20s. Well, when the sheriff's department caught wind that Inobe fit the description, Officer Kenny Elliott went to question him. Now that I look at these pictures side by side, I can see the resemblance, although maybe the medium-build description was a little vague, and I bet that's why there was a discrepancy with the weight and the face. There's enough of a difference that it makes sense why none of the tips led to the killer. On June 6th, Elliott showed Inobe a picture of Jamie and asked him if he knew her. He said he didn't, but he did agree to give a DNA sample. This was the 85th sample that Detective Elliott had processed through the system. And remember, there was DNA collected at Jamie's crime scene on and inside her body, sadly, but also thankfully, because 17 days after that, all the forensic evidence came back in, and it was official. The DNA under Carolyn's fingernails was Inobe's. The fiber of clothing found on Carolyn's clothes was Inobe's. And a few fibers on Inobe's shirt were found after processing the clothes that matched up with Carolyn's underwear. There weren't fingerprints, but it didn't matter. He was the culprit. As for Jamie, the semen that was found on her body belonged to Inobe, and Kristen agreed to testify under oath that Inobe was pure evil, that he lured her into a trap and she was lucky she made it out alive. They had their man, or I should say their monster. When Carolyn's parents, Larry and Anita, got the call from Detective Capps saying they had captured their daughter's murderer, Larry asked if he was absolutely sure they had the right guy. Detective Capps's exact words were that he would bet the farm on it. Carolyn's funeral services were held at Covenant Family Church. She was laid to rest in Waco Memorial Park. There was very little relief knowing her killer was behind bars. Not when he had taken so much. When Chuck realized that he was finally off the hook, he wanted to feel relieved, but he had been fighting for his innocence all year in hopes that police would stop targeting him and capture Jamie's real killer. It took Carolyn's murder for the officers to connect all the dots. Another girl had to die for Jamie to get justice, and Chuck couldn't help feeling that this entire second case could have been prevented. He told them that he thought the killer would strike again, and he was right. And I have to wonder, if this were just one town with one department and not two towns with 3 departments, would they have captured him faster? Officer Elliott said that if he had to do this case over, he would still focus his efforts on Chuck and not change any part of his investigation. He says that, but he said he genuinely tried his best. 5 weeks after his arrest, when he was presented with all the DNA evidence, Inobi confessed that he entered Jamie's car by force, took her to the oil field entrance where he sexually violated her, and then hit her in the head multiple times. However, he said he didn't kill her, and wouldn't say whether he threw her out of the car or if she jumped. He didn't say where he kidnapped her or if he knew her, so we will never know. But Inobi was charged in Jamie's murder, and his bail jumped to $900,000. At Carolyn's trial in June of 2001, it came out that this man was linked to 7 forced intercourse cases and several attempted ones as well, and somehow there was never enough evidence to convict him. His attorney thought that she would be able to get him out of this if he pleaded guilty. After all, 2 other juries had refused to indict him. But now, murder was involved, and prosecuting attorney Bill Turner presented the cold, hard facts. Several of his targets testified that he would toy with his victims by strangling them and then bringing them back to consciousness. One of those women was Misty Johnson. She had been attacked by Inobi just a couple of months before Jamie had been killed. She was so terrified that she quit her job, left town, and couldn't believe the man she was able to get away from went on to kill other women. It was hard on her, Kristen, and the other victims. They felt guilty they hadn't done more to put him behind bars. But it's scary. Kristen actually called Jamie and Carolyn her alternative future. And what she meant by this is that she realized she could have been killed. She remembered opening the newspaper and seeing Inobi's picture in connection to Carolyn's murder, and thinking she wished that she had tried harder to make the police believe her version of events. But I do want to thank her for being so brave and so open about her heartbreaking story. It is not her fault that this evil man did this to her or these other women. He's the only one responsible for his actions. After Kristen testified, she met both Jamie and Carolyn's families, and they do not hold any grudges at all. Kristen calls herself lucky to be alive. She understands how fragile life is and how easily someone else can take it away. Inobi was convicted of capital murder in Carolyn's case. The jury sentenced him to death. Later that year, he was tried for Jamie's murder and received life in prison on top of his pre-existing death sentence. In 2001, death row took about 10.4 years on average. That is a long time, but it's all because people try to appeal as many times as possible to reduce their sentence to life without parole. But Inobi decided not to appeal. In his last days, he said he made his so-called mistakes, but I call them choices. Inobi was set for his lethal injection on January 6, 2004, and after that deadly dose of medicine was administered, he whispered, "I love y'all," to his sister and cousin while blowing a kiss in their direction before losing consciousness. He never gave a final statement, and honestly, it does kind of make me sick that he died such a peaceful death after Jamie and Carolyn died in terror. He also got a final meal of his choice, which is traditional in death penalty cases, and his request was 3 pieces of fried chicken, 1 pork chop, 2 pieces of fried fish, strawberry ice cream, a 6-pack of Coca-Cola, and a pack of Newport cigarettes. The cigarettes were refused for prison policy. But do you think that people on death row should be entitled to a last meal? Let me know your thoughts. The Casey family watched the execution, and they will never get over the loss of Carolyn. She had her whole life ahead of her. Larry, Anita, and Amanda remember how much she adored kids and desperately wished she had been able to get married and have kids of her own. For Jim, LaDonna, Katie, Lisa, and Vicky, the process of seeking justice for Jamie drained them. Donna said, "We feel satisfaction from the verdict, but it was hard to sit through. We're not vengeful people. I've been praying for 2 years for God to take the hatred I felt for this man from my heart. I had to let go." Chuck says he still misses Jamie. What he misses most are the little things, running errands and watching movies on the couch. He still remembers that last argument, the one that Jamie's friends had thought put them on the verge of a breakup. They argued about bread. The grocery store bagger had accidentally put a cantaloupe on top of a loaf of bread and smashed it. Jamie got upset, but Chuck told her he didn't think it was a big deal, and that's what they got in this petty fight about a loaf of bread. And that's so real. They were in their early 20s. They were stressed out about work, trying to build their life together. I know many of us have had our fair share of dumb arguments. Every year, more college students commit to Texas A&M, more alumni are honored at the muster ceremony, and more people get their class rings.